Unfortunately, his name was Joseph W. Schartz.
I'm sorry.
But
I was not expecting Schartz.
yeah.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another daring episode of Left Unread. My name's Will.
My name is Aaron. We are two dudes engaged in radical self-education.
That's right. We're simply two guys that have finally finished reading Karl Marx's Capital, and we're now gazing out at the abyss that is late-stage capitalism in America, trying to figure out what the fuck is going on.
That's correct. I guess in that vein, this episode we have read Socialist Reconstruction by PSL.
Yeah, PSL, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, probably one of the few genuinely active ML parties in the U.S. today, at least definitely one of the largest. Take that with a grain of salt, right? After splintering from the Workers' World Party in 2004, PSL has advocated strongly for revolution and revolutionary change in the U.S., preaching democratic centralism. PSL is active in numerous U.S. cities, 50 as of 2024, as the last I saw. Wisely, they don't publish their membership numbers. But, in my honest opinion, you could do worse if you're looking for a communist party that's doing something actively.
Yeah, I would agree. We have a chapter in our area.
Yep. Unfortunately, it's mostly focused in the Cincinnati area, so, that's fine. I mean, I understand that. But, PSL, they're doing work. They've run a candidate in every election since they've splintered off, essentially, which I appreciate. Thoughts on electoralism aside, I mean, it's important just to do it to spread your name. I think that's the attitude that they're running with when it comes to pushing for presidential candidates.
For sure. And in the context of electoralism, the idea of having a candidate that brings issues to the table that potentially can change the conversation around the presumptive candidate that's actually going to take the ticket is useful in the public discourse.
Yeah, although I will say that on my last presidential ballot, which was in the great state of Georgia, the PSL candidates were actually excluded. So if I had voted for them, it wouldn't have counted anyway. Very cool. Very cool.
Yeah, so
Socialist Reconstruction. Why did we pick this book?
Why did we pick this book? Well, this book came on my radar some time ago, and what was appealing to me about it was that it's a modern book written in the last 5 years, which is pretty unheard of for a lot of the sort of stuff that we're reading for this show.
Absolutely.
And it is written with a very U.S.-centric view, which helps answer a lot of the kind of questions. That, tied to it being a modern text, helps, in theory, answer a lot of the questions that we've brought to other theoretical texts that we've read for the show.
Yeah.
What does this mean in 21st century United States is a question that comes up pretty much anytime we read anything.
Yes.
And so the idea that this is written from the perspective of the 21st century United States was appealing to me.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. I mean, part of the reason that I wanted to read this book is in the title, right? If we're putting the revolution aside, which that's something I'm sure we'll talk about, what would it actually look like to build society with socialism in mind, to change the goals of society away from profit towards the needs of the people, right? What would that actually look like? If you look at the fabric of the U.S. as it stands today, it is insanely large, intricate. It's woven a million different ways. And so to think about how we would try to organize a country as large as the United States, I almost said as diverse, but yeah, as diverse as the United States, whether that's in people or geography, right? How would that actually look in a government that is focused on the people, right? And I think that although there's some issues with the interpretation put forward by PSL here, it was really useful overall to just have a picture, right? To, as they say in the book, right, to have a socialist horizon, And so that's nice. It comes with its own issues, but they're very clear about why they're writing it. They understand that it's a little silly sometimes to say, here's how the socialist paradise will be built, but they're still willing to put forth a vision and say, here's something that we could really build towards. Here's an actual policy that could affect you materially, right? It could change the fabric of society towards something that we as communists are looking to embrace.
Yeah, and in addition to all of that, I think, I'll speak for both of us, I guess. I think that we are both shifting our mindset a lot more toward the idea of what organization in our area at this time looks like, what it should look like, what it can look like. And this book was on our radar for that reason, to see what are the kind of lofty goals that they expect in the 10 years after a revolution takes place. What is administration of a socialist reconstruction in the United States going to look like? That, in theory, should help inform organization leading up to a proletarian revolution. And so I've been thinking about it in that case. And in that context, ideas get thrown about sometimes in the discourse, in communist discourse, like we were talking before we started recording about, like the idea of nationalizing Amazon, for example. That infrastructure exists. After a revolution has begun, if that infrastructure remains, that's something that can and perhaps should be put to use in a socialist reconstruction. And I was really curious to see the extension of ideas like that.
Yeah.
Hopeful to get ideas like that presented in the text.
Yeah. There's something else I'll preface this with before we start, is that something that I did really appreciate here is that it's not an example because it hasn't happened. It's still something in theory, but it's like it's taking the ideals that we've already read about and putting them into practice in a modern context. I'm thinking mainly about when we've been reading Stalin and Lenin, and they're talking about activating the people to be part of government, a mass participation. I mean, even Mao talks about that, obviously. When it's talking about really mobilizing the people for participation in the government, all the examples that we've had of that have been in history actually existing socialism. And that's mixed if you're being honest with yourself, right? Like, can you say that the USSR was mobilizing 150 million people into politics in the way that they talked about in their own theory? I don't know if you necessarily can. I mean, there's at least some historical debate about that. Mm-hmm. And so to take those same principles and say that we're still talking about the same ideals, the same principles, the same methods even. We're just talking about it in a modern context. It really shows how the application of these things can be different even if the ideal is the same. If we're talking about mobilizing massive organizations of people to take part in government, it might be more useful for us to look at what is possible in the future than what actually happened in the past.
Yeah, that's well said. I agree.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah. I mean, that was just on my mind a lot, especially around that kind of massive mobilization. Now there's still some issues there with like, what does that actually look like? How does that happen in practice? But like, that's something that they're more than willing to acknowledge, is that like, this is something that we're talking about in theory. It will change when it's put into practice. And that's just important to remember. That's something important to couch all of these ideas in as we're moving forward. Is that putting these things into practice will actually change those things as well.
Yeah. And it's effectively a preface, if not literally a preface, to every single chapter that we don't know what this will actually look like, but here's an idea of what we would want.
Yeah.
There's always going to be some sort of foundation there that's unclear, because the presumption of the text is that this is a post-revolution decade after the rebuilding, the literal reconstruction of our new socialist world.
Yeah. And there's something funny about a 5-year plan, a 10-year plan, because it feels a little LARPy. You know what I mean? It's like, yeah, well, obviously we're doing a planned economy. Obviously we'll have a 5-year plan. But in my mind, anytime I think of the 5-year plan, I always think of like Stalin, I always think of like the USSR in that context. So it's just there's like a tinge of LARP in there. It's like, yeah, this is our 5-year plan. But still, putting the theory into practice will change the theory. So.
Note for the punks out there, 5-Year Plan is a great song by DRI.
Nice.
Look into it.
Love that.
Okay, so with this book, I think we should maybe approach it a little differently than we have other texts in the past. Because largely, if I was going to say overall what is the approach of the book, every single chapter, the answer to the question that they present in the chapter is collectivization.
Yeah.
We're going to nationalize whatever this thing is we're talking about, and here's what that will look like.
Yeah, just make the People's Department of X.
Yeah.
People's Department of Y.
And so to talk about each individual thing maybe is going to start to feel a little redundant. So I think it probably makes sense for us to start with a broader view, and I made a quick little list of what I was calling goods and gripes, things that I like about the arguments presented in the book from a zoomed out perspective, and things that I take issue with. And I thought maybe that would get us started with the conversation.
Yeah, totally.
I would say first and foremost, to start on the positive note, and something that obviously in all of the historic texts that we've been reading is not predominant in the narrative, that is very much predominant here, is there is a clear dedication to responding to the climate catastrophe in every policy decision they're making.
Yes. Yeah, that was huge for me, especially. I mean, they say it very well in the book where they say that, like, we're past the point of piecemeal solution, you know? I mean, I've said it before, but, like, I feel very much like a climate Stalinist in that regard, because I am willing to acknowledge the fact that it will take a serious, planned, concerted effort something that will not be easy, nor, not painful. I mean, painless. It won't be easy. It won't be painless. It will be a serious thing to undertake, to change society in a way that prevents us from boiling ourselves alive.
Yeah.
So that was great.
Yeah, and I appreciate that they mention it in pretty much every single chapter. It's a part of every policy decision because it is absolutely paramount that it be at the forefront of every decision being made. Now, you can argue about the shortcomings of the argument that they present in that case, or you can argue about the fact that they're presenting in this text a socialist reconstruction of one country while the climate catastrophe is clearly a global problem.
Yeah.
But I think that we'll talk about that. I think that they're still on the right track.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the focus of this book is on the U.S. and yeah, we'll certainly talk about it, right? But I feel very strongly that it's a cut the head off the snake kind of deal, right? If you were suddenly to put the U.S. in this position, even with all the rest of the world as it is, if it were to truly try to be a leader in positive human-focused development, I think that it could affect serious change in the world, even in the context of socialism in one country. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I actually have that as one of my other pros for their argument here, that because it's so uniquely U.S. focused at its base, this is acknowledging the U.S.'s current stance as a global superpower, and that if it were to lead the charge, that it could have a pretty massive global impact.
Yeah. For
all persons, I would say.
Sure. To think back to when Stalin says that there is a peaceful path to socialism for capitalist countries, it just involves encirclement. If you think about the way that the U.S. already encircles the world with its military bases, with its funding, with its aid programs even, there is an argument to be made there, believe it or not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a really good connection. I can keep going.
By all means, yeah, keep going.
Though I find it sometimes a little half-baked, I appreciate an intersectional approach that this book is taking.
Yeah.
That's not discounting the historical legacy of capitalist imperialism and how that has had uneven effects on particular marginalized groups in the world.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that acknowledgement.
Yeah, we'll have to talk about some of the solutions, because yes. I think that this point is mixed together with another pro and con of mine, which is that a pro is that they're very quick to acknowledge in the beginning that part of this program will have to be changing people's minds. It will have to be undemonizing socialism as a concept, right? The con is that there's a lot of solutions for other problems that I don't think necessarily mesh with that kind of sympathetic change that they're talking about. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And I think that becomes apparent in some of the solutions about oppressed peoples, And I'm not trying to do cover for the fucking idiot racists of the world or of the U.S. or whatever, but just for example, imagine you and your 30% popular group, which is what the Bolsheviks had, right? Take control and start rearranging society, and you say, we're going to make a bicameral legislature, one of which is a House of Peoples of Oppressed Nations. Mm-hmm. That's a wild change to implement. And I think that it is a good change. I mean, I think that it's at least a step in the right direction in terms of ensuring equity in decision making for people that have historically been oppressed. Mm-hmm. And I think that they're even very well intentioned in their acknowledgement of the fact that any kind of reparation is not going to erase the stain on our history. Mm-hmm. But there's a conflict there, right? I mean, there's a conflict in the kinds of sweeping changes you're talking about and the people that you're dealing with at the end of the day.
And their rightful acknowledgement that a transition to a socialist implementation is not going to do away with all of the isms of the past.
Right.
Certainly not immediately.
Yeah.
And so to make broad sweeping changes like that while acknowledging that the masses of people will not have a broad consciousness shift in every aspect of their lives will be in conflict.
Yeah, and again, I'd rather them write these solutions out and then try to wrangle with those problems afterwards than to leave them out, I think that kind of address is important. But I just think it's also important to recognize that this is the biggest con of the book for me, is that the context of the revolution is incredibly important for what comes after. Mm-hmm. And, the biggest question in my mind is what happened to the capitalists? What happened to all the people that would otherwise oppose you? I mean, they do talk a little bit at the end of the book about organizations for people's defense against counter-revolution.
Not enough.
Not enough, I agree. But it would be impossible for them to talk about without addressing the revolution-shaped hole that exists in this book. Well, where did the capitalists go? We're nationalizing all of these companies. Are we assuming that they're dead? right? If they're all killed in revolution, then okay, I guess. But they also talk about things like, we're going to get rid of all of the advertising jobs and insurance jobs. Then we'll have 6 to 7 million people to mobilize into other industries. It's like, you're doing a lot of assumption there that these people are going to be willing at all to change it. You know, I mean, like, I don't want to get so nitty gritty on it, but right, you've just abolished an industry, somebody in there who's been working for 30 or 45 years, what are you expecting them to do otherwise? You know, if it's collectively take out the trash and fix people's roofs, you're going to get some pushback in that regard. You know what I mean?
Sure.
And I am more than willing to give this book the benefit of the doubt. I really, really am. But I just think that there's a lot of that in here.
Yeah, hand waviness is what I was calling it.
Yeah.
Just like kind of hand wave away of the finer details.
Yeah. That's where the devil is, y'all. The devil's in the details.
I would say, though, just as a general statement, I would prefer the position that they took in the text, which is like, this is the correct action to take, and acknowledge that that's the action that should be taken, even if they don't do a good enough job of addressing how they will defend against the reaction to that action.
Yeah. I'm in agreement with you.
Yeah.
I am. You know, like to go back to the House of Oppressed Peoples, I think that that's a genuine solution.
Yeah.
You know, that's like a step in the right direction when we're talking about equity. You know, I think that that's totally reasonable.
Yeah.
Right? I'm just also thinking about everything else. And I'm sure they were too. I'm not. What I really wanted was to talk to PSL people that like knew about what they were writing about here and to ask them further questions, you know.
Well, there's a list of 29 contributors at the very first page here, so
I'll email all of them.
Yeah.
Hey, just a quick question here. Can I say real quick, here's a con for sure. Do not listen to this book on audiobook, okay? There are 29 contributors, and I believe that each of them read their own chapter. So it is a stark difference between chapters in terms of the narrator. Mm-hmm. I did not enjoy it. PSL, if you're listening, let it be known. I would rather have one person.
Fair enough. Well, you already kind of addressed one of my cons. I mean, I still have a couple of goods, but I'll jump into one of my gripes. I think I understand why they did it, but the presumption of a completed revolution as the starting point to talking about this just leaves so many fucking wild gaps in the argument.
Yeah.
That I found myself the whole time reading it asking, well, what did that actually look like? Like you said, what happened to all the capitalists? Will any of this infrastructure still exist? You know, questions like that are coming up constantly while reading the text, and it's largely because they're making this presumption at the get. I get that it makes their argument easier, and perhaps it is even a boon for what I would guess their intended purpose for writing the text is that, like, let's gloss over that part. Let's jump over the part that makes everyone uncomfortable, the violent, bloody part.
Yeah.
And let's get to the part where we can actually see people's material needs being met, what that will look like.
Yeah.
But
I think
that's a pretty big jump to make.
I think that it's something to be said about who the audience for this book is, you know? Is this book written for us particularly? No, I don't think so.
No.
I mean, I think it's written for, like, my mom. Hey, Mom, you should check this book out, Socialist Reconstruction by PSL. I'll send you a copy.
I was going to say, send it to her.
Yeah. But, like, that's really what it is. You know, for people who have thought about our society as it stands today, and they think that it would be a lot harder to change in a way that, to change socialistically, right? To be coordinated cooperatively, that kind of thing. And I also think that, like, something else that's a pro of this is that it points out all of these glaring errors that exist in today's society, you know, in very concrete ways with, you know, statistics and philosophy behind it, all sorts of things. I mean, that I think is really powerful. For us, I'm sure it didn't have as much of an effect because we're steeped in this stuff all day, every day. Like, were there any statistics in here that you didn't already know?
No.
Yeah, I don't think there was anything that jumped out to me and I was like, wow, holy shit, you know, like a couple historical notes that I thought were really interesting, but
these aren't statistics, but there were a couple of things in, I think, the very first chapter that got mentioned that I was like, what? Because they mentioned Dayton and Toledo, and they mentioned some stuff in Cincinnati, and I didn't know about that, so I did look that up. Those aren't statistics, but it is historical precedent that I wasn't aware of.
Same here. But, like, you know, I mean, there's some things that were more shocking than I expected, but, like, the thing is that we're a little past this, you know? So I think that this book is useful for someone who might not have any vision of what socialism could look like, you know? However, there are still some questions unanswered. In my mind, particularly about the market, particularly about how people get things in general. That is kind of unaddressed. And I think that was a big thing for me.
Yeah, I don't mean this in a condescending way, but one of the pros that I wrote for the book is that I do think it is a good baby leftist introduction.
Totally.
And I don't mean that as a pejorative.
Right.
But like if you're dipping your toes in the water, you don't already have the kind of foundational knowledge of the historical precedent and all of the other theory that's taken place. This is a really good starting point, I think.
Yeah.
To be a nerd, one of my gripes was that they do offer some statistics and a little bit of data. I don't think that it is well enough sourced. I mean, there is an index in the back of all of their hypertext notes or whatever where they've sourced stuff. And I looked at those and they're all generally pretty credible things, but this is not an academic text by any stretch.
Yeah. Certainly.
Another thing that you already mentioned that I want to bring up as a gripe is that there's no real discussion of defense from outward pressure.
Yeah.
It's not even counter-revolution from within the United States, but counter-revolution from outside of the United States. They don't make one mention of that, what other global powers might do if the U.S. were to try to make such a seismic shift, like a socialist reconstruction.
Not to mention what they would have already done to get to this point. You know, a revolution will not go without outside interference regardless. I mean, the U.S. has allies.
Yeah, and I would argue that it's overly dismissive of military defense after the revolution as well, and naive about the global response through the whole process.
There's one point where they say that, like, institutions like the CIA will just have to be abolished. It's like, yes, I agree. What are you doing with all of those people? You know, like, there are literally, like, systems that have been set up over the last 100 years, right? Like, just abolish the CIA. It's not a crazy position. It's a necessary one, but there's so much that goes into that. Like, are you rehabilitating all of these people? Are you re-educating all of these people? Are you exiling all of these? You know, I mean, like, there's so much that goes into some of these things that it's just completely glanced over in this that I was a little unsatisfied by.
Yeah, I think that I don't mean to be prescriptive or whatever, but it seems to me that they were glossing over the most uncomfortable parts of these conversations. Like, abolish the CIA, yes, correct position. What does that look like? It probably involves a wall. And that's the sort of thing that makes a lot of people uncomfortable and pushes people away from the idea of a socialist reconstruction because they view it as authoritarian or overly authoritarian. And that's true of the entire conversation about the revolution as well. Like, they're making jumps like that, I think, strategically, but for folks like us, it does leave us wanting.
Wanting, yes. Yeah, I think that's reasonable. Did you have other pros and cons?
One more good, one more gripe.
Okay.
One more good is that I did actually appreciate, you'd mentioned before that they do a good job of showing how the systems are already in failure. I really liked the whole section on federalism and the failures of federalism. And I really loved the example that they were using about women's access to abortions, birthing people's rights to access to abortions, and how that changes state to state, and how the federalist view of the implementation of policy creates access problems. I liked how clearly they spelled that out, and I think that there are a lot of libs that would read something like that and maybe have their eyes opened for the first time about how access is not equal for all people.
Dude, I mean, the most damning line in that whole section was when they say, smoke and soot do not respect state boundaries, you know? It's like, we are simply moving to a world where we can't really afford to have this separation. And to what end is this separation really for? You know what I mean? Like, when I think about a federal system that might be successful, and I know that I'm a stand in this department, but it's Yugoslavia, right? There's a reason for having federally autonomous sections in the case of something like there's a bunch of ethnic minorities in this country that require self-determination or autonomy. You know, you can see that system working out in a place like Yugoslavia, but when we're talking about the United States, especially in today's day, it's very homogenous, you know, like it's not really diverse enough for us to necessitate this kind of federal system, I feel, you know, and that's really it. I was just thinking about, like, what were the arguments for it back in the day, but I can't even remember what they are now, you know? Yeah,
other than something else that they address, which is the abolition of the Senate, which was created to give equal power to unequal territory.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if we want to just kind of break into it, but I mean, I like that they talk about just getting rid of states altogether, you know, literally redrawing into rational fractional administrative units. I mean, talk about a change that's so crazy. You can't even, I can't help but think about the repercussions. You know what I mean? Give the Upper Peninsula back to Wisconsin. That's all I'm saying.
Well, to that end, my last remaining gripe, which I think maybe we'll get into specifically when we start looking at some stuff in the chapter, but I felt like overall the book is awfully vague and often overly optimistic. There's a question in my mind when they're talking about community-based initiatives all the time, while all of these other departments are being nationalized, about top-down versus bottom-up conversation. And because they haven't addressed currency, it's still a part of the conversation, and oftentimes they're talking about funding being granted to communities on an as-needed basis. And the question of, is that a top-down or a bottom-up initiative? There are going to be competing interests at play.
Right.
What does that actually look like? They don't get into that in any meaningful way.
Yeah.
And that makes it pretty difficult to buy in to a lot of what they're saying.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to stray too far into the tyranny of the majority or whatever, but if we're relying on mass organizations, what's to stop a mass organization of something that's counter-revolutionary, I don't, that's the kind of zoomed in gripe that I think is not necessarily worth harping on too much.
Yeah, I would agree.
But the thing is that, there's kind of a dialectical nature, honestly, they talk about between having democratic centralism and mass democracy. There is a conflict between the two, but the goal of this project, in the book, is to enlarge that system, especially in the massive democracies part of things, to the point where that conflict is kind of resolved.
Yeah.
It would be interesting to experience what that looks like, but it's impossible to talk about,
Yeah, and that is largely where the vagary comes from. They do a lot of we can't prescribe, which really just kind of means we don't know or we can't know.
Yeah. How could we?
Yeah.
Honestly.
Which is fair, but unsatisfying.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so if we want to jump into the nitty-gritty, the book is comprised of 10 chapters. It's got the preface and introduction, obviously. And then Chapter 1 looks at kind of the history of socialism in the United States. Chapter 2 talks through what socialist government would actually look like or mean. Mm-hmm. And then from that point, they get into specific policy positions. So they go through energy, debt and finance capital, agriculture, housing and transportation, medicine, education, crime, and then war before hitting the conclusion.
All right.
So we'll go one at a time and see what stands out to us.
See what pops up.
Anything in particular from the preface?
Well, I think that the most interesting thing from the preface was just considering, I don't know, what it made me think of was when they say that anti-communism is the unofficial religion in the United States. I saw a tweet from someone that said that we need to be more than anti-communists. And I think that, that's something that I do really appreciate about this book, is that we're talking about, what are the actual structures that could be put in place? But it's just been on my mind a lot, because even in, the way that some communists support, the axis of resistance, they have support for Iran, what we're looking for is really to be more than just, anti-U.S., we're talking about changing this place to be something that is fundamentally better for everybody in the world. And it's not just for funsies, it has to change, you know? And so that's just really what spoke to me most in the preface, is that the writers of this book are aware of the issues with the writing of this book, but they think that it is worthwhile to write regardless. So I appreciated that.
Yeah, we've talked in the past when discussing organization on the show about how educational outreach and consciousness building seem to be too absent.
Yeah.
Largely because it does kind of feel like communists are fighting an uphill battle in that regard, because there's such a long history of anti-communist sentiment in this country.
Yeah.
And I agree. They actually say on page 4, IV, Roman numerals were in the preface, making vivid the socialist future and getting people to discuss and debate this now under capitalism is especially important for the development of any revolutionary process in the United States. Yeah. I agree with that, and I think it's important for us to acknowledge that the ideological war is uneven. We can't, like you said, we can't just be anti-communist because we're standing on the foundation of an argument that is already anti-communist. It's not just about fighting it back. We need to dig ourselves out of that.
Yeah.
We need to be explicitly combating that discourse, that sentiment, and present a positive position to the working class to win them over.
Yeah. Sorry to trot post here. Sorry to quote Trotsky, but to ask the questions that require socialist answers. That's really, I think that is a genuine thing to keep in mind. And I even love, I think on the first page, they really put it clearly, and I genuinely appreciated them saying this right off the cuff. Socialists cannot expect to make a revolution by being the best and most dedicated organizers in the mass struggle and then hope that one of these mass struggles simply gives way to socialist leadership. Neither is it sufficient, given the urgency of the times, to win people over to socialism in ones and twos, right? We need a larger cultural movement. And I just think that that's genuinely uplifting to see that statement, because I get the feeling from so many people that have socialist sympathies, at least, that it's just like about waiting for this whole thing to collapse and then my ideology will rise from the ashes,
Yeah.
To call yourself a Leninist, I think, is to fight against that kind of thing, because you need to understand that, like, you, the revolutionary, has an active role in this movement, in a lot of different ways. I mean, it's more than just being organized and being ready. It's about actually being active and part of that struggle. And on the flip side of that, too, it's that we can't just talk about ones and twos, we can't talk about just like, I'm convincing you personally, I'm growing my movement one at a time. That's really the biggest respect I have for PSL, is that if I imagine myself starting an organization and growing it naturally, I think it would end up looking like that. I don't see where there would be such a programmatic difference that I wouldn't have an organization that's not exactly the same. I don't know enough about PSL to say that with like 100% certainty, but that's really the feeling I get, and that's been kind of my dismay in the past about where we stand in the US today with the organizations that actually exist, because while some of them I find lacking, the problem I have is that if I were to do the same thing, I would end up in the same place. Then it's a question of like, is it worth joining this struggle and then trying to change it, or disregarding it altogether, And I don't think disregarding it altogether is the answer.
Yeah, and my response to that is I'm all wrapped up in my thoughts here about my shifting attitude toward figures like Bernie, and Mamdani now is, I guess, the most recent example, because while I do think they advance discourse in a way that can be helpful toward shifting the collective consciousness of the people, the idea that they're funneling folks into the Democratic Party as a result of that and ultimately undoing all of the consciousness shifting that their work in theory has done,
sure,
is very frustrating to me.
Yeah.
So it's like, it really sucks. It really sucks. I don't know what to say other than that.
I think it's a larger conversation that's outside of the scope of this book, obviously. But I don't know. I'm still willing to hold space in my coalition for sewer socialists. When I'm thinking about the kind of coalition building that still has the best interest in mind, I think that someone like Zoran is part of that. And I definitely understand the argument that a lot of people make, and that you just made, about funneling people back into the Democratic Party. But I think where we're at right now presents itself as an exciting opportunity for someone like Zoran to show people that the Democratic Party is unsatisfactory, in the way that we were talking about when we discussed left-wing communism, to support someone like Zoran and see his earnest efforts stymied by the forces that are supposed to be supportive, i.e. the Democratic Party. I mean, you can already see that in the way that, like, Hakeem Jeffries has refused to endorse him. I'm dubious of hypocrisy rhetoric overall, but if we've been told for the last 10 years to vote blue no matter who, and here's those same people saying, no, I can't do that, he's a socialist, I think for many people, that's the kind of disillusionment with the Democratic Party that might be required.
Well, this kind of traces a thread that I was carrying through the text. I don't necessarily want to jump all the way through it right now, I guess, but in a recent episode, I was kind of talking about the correct way to engage liberals.
Yeah.
Like every leftist was a liberal at some point is something that I said.
Yeah.
And, like, what was the thing that radicalized you? What was the thing that brought you farther along in the conversation?
Yeah.
And
it was a non-contradiction.
Okay, so how can we inculcate that in as many folks as possible was the question that I think I poorly phrased at that time. It was kind of, how do we leave space for these people, right? Like folks that are sympathetic to the cause, but maybe not on board with it all the way, that see Bernie as the answer, not as a means to consciousness raising to get to the actual answer or whatever. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think that there's a lot of that woven throughout this book. It's just, the question still stands. And I think, like, especially, they do address the kind of duopoly that's really a monopoly of the two-party system as it currently stands. They do address that in the book. And there is some rhetoric in the text about the Democrats aren't your saviors either. They are also an operating subject of the ruling class. You know what I mean? But I don't know. There's still something about that's kind of dyspeptic to me that just doesn't sit quite right. And it's not, I don't feel like it pushes the narrative far enough.
Okay.
Because what we do know, this was what I was thinking a moment ago that I was having trouble figuring out how to get to. What we do know and maybe to push back on something I said 5 minutes ago, there is popular support for a lot of nationalized things now, but we don't actually live in a democracy. So the fact that everyone wants single-payer universal health care, I won't say everyone, but the majority, over 70% of people want universal health care. The majority of people are interested in gun control or whatever. The majority of people are dissatisfied with members of Congress. The fact that a majority holds those opinions, but nothing is being done to change the status quo, is indicative that your opinion is meaningless in this context.
Yeah.
So why is that not a radicalizing enough position for these folks?
I don't know. People still see potential for power in the Democratic Party, right? I mean, I don't know what it's going to take to break that kind of thing, but I think that it starts with having a organized alternative. And that's part of why I think that it's fine for PSL to run candidates, because, you know, even if they didn't get jack shit votes in the last election, the fact that they were still popular enough to be in the media even, I mean, that does something. I think that in the scope of our current media landscape, it wasn't necessarily a good thing, but that's kind of where it all ties together for me.
I suppose. I don't know. And I know I immediately derailed us, but the like, we're 3 years out from a presidential election, which
no, we aren't.
I'm not even convinced it's going to happen.
Yeah, come on.
But the fact that we're already getting pushback from people saying like, Newsom's going to be the candidate. You have to, you know, don't worry about the fact that he broke up homeless encampments throughout the state. He's trolling Trump. Aren't you? Don't you want to be an anti-Trump guy? It's like,
it's done.
When is the point that you can be critical of this party?
Never is the answer.
Never is the answer. Yeah.
Never
so
is
like,
the answer.
How do we ever escape this cycle? That I don't know. I'm just wrapped up in that.
Dude, I said out loud, I said, if the Democrats, if the best that they have to offer in 2028, which I know is a long ways away, is Gavin Newsom or Pete Buttigieg, I will be violently ill. I think I will turn westward and walk into the setting sun.
It's not the best they can offer. It's what they will offer.
Yeah, it's what they will offer, right. There are better alternatives. But the thing is, it's like whom? Right. That's the problem, you know, is that like the people who are better alternatives are pushed out already. You know what I mean?
That's why the formation of an alternative party is the only way electoralism can be a part of this conversation in any meaningful way.
Yeah. And I don't think it should be the dominant method either.
I agree with that. But like back to the original thing that I said, that's where my frustration with Bernie really comes from. Bernie saw the way the DNC played him in 2016, and he still tried again in 2020, and he still funneled all of his supporters, still continues to push them toward the same Democratic centrism, not centralism. And that's really fucking frustrating when in 2016, when he got ousted by the DNC, would have been the time to start building an alternative party.
To say, fuck this.
Yeah.
Right? The people want change. Here it is. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, not the solution, but a way to start mobilizing folks in this sort of way. Anyway.
Yeah, we're in agreement there. Sorry to get so far away from the book.
Yeah. We're not even on page 1 yet.
I know. Okay, so I think that's everything I had from the preface, though.
I have one other thing. There's this line on page 7. They're talking about why they've structured the text the way they have. They say, we don't have a climate chapter because it requires comprehensive action in all major fields of policy. Energy, transportation, housing, agriculture, and so on. Likewise, the other burning struggles of our time over racism, women's oppression, LGBTQ oppression are not separated into issue-based concepts, but instead threaded throughout the book. The answer to institutional and structural oppression is to uproot all those institutions and structures. I 100% agree with that. You know, there's no queer Marxism, there's no black Marxism, there's Marxism.
Yeah.
You know, like, I do believe that to be ultimately true, but in this context that we're talking about for the intended audience of this book, I am thinking a little bit about, like, what is the way to win favor for a party, a movement around socialist reconstruction? Is there a way where developing consciousness around issues like that and helping people connect the dots that, like, decolonizing our attitudes is the way we deal with colonialism? You know, dismantling the structures and institutions of oppression in the United States is how we deal with institutional racism, how we deal with institutional misogyny, helping people connect the dots in that sort of way. I don't know. I felt a little of two minds, because I think, like, there's a part of me that's like, correct, there's no queer Marxism, there's Marxism.
Yeah.
But then there's another part of me that's like, that's a reasonably advanced attitude to take, because people that are very much aware of issues of queer oppression may not recognize that level of consciousness yet. You know?
Well, I think that there's a back and forth with it, you know. We're talking about involving these massive organizations, right? That includes queer organizations.
For sure.
You know, so in a way, there's a back and forth. we're saying your lived experience, your lived oppression is genuine and valid. We can bring that into our organization and understand that. And also, likewise, we're also giving to you the fact that, like, that's part of a larger structure, and the answer might be to change the structure. You know what I mean? So I think that it's all wrapped together in that regard.
Yeah, cool.
And I mean, if we're talking about, not to skip too far ahead, but they talk about reintegrating people that are currently incarcerated, and they're saying that those people, having seen the oppression of the system firsthand, are really valuable as like mentors and pillars of the community in that regard. It's like the same can be said for people that have experienced oppression firsthand through their different intersectionalities, right? So I think it's just as valuable.
Yeah, for sure. In the context that they're presenting here, which is we are post-revolution reconstruction phase, the third reconstruction they call it. What you hear folks say all of the time that like used to have, say, homophobic attitudes or whatever is like they didn't know one of their best friends was queer.
Yeah.
And when they realize that, they're like, oh shit, there's nothing wrong with being queer, you know? And it's like it's only through that direct one-on-one interaction that they start to dismantle those kind of oppressive structures in their own mind.
Yeah.
Those bigoted structures in their own mind. And so, like, on a community level, in this context, that makes a lot of sense. It's like you got a diversity of people around you. You are no longer afraid of diversity.
Yeah.
I lost the thread of what my original thought was.
You're good, man. Yeah. There's nothing else that I did want to point out from the preface that I had skipped over earlier, but right above at that same page, I guess technically it starts on page 6. The book's taking on a major talking point, anti-socialist indoctrination, apples and oranges comparisons, and I think that it is important to just point out the example that they give is comparing Cuba to the U.S.
Yeah.
They say this false framing always serves to put socialists on the defensive. A true comparison would be to compare socialist Cuba to capitalist Cuba or to other nearby capitalist countries. Here the superiority of the socialist system is evident.
Yeah.
And I just think that it's just hugely important. Every historical communist movement, for the most part, maybe 95% of them, if you're comparing it to what was in place before in those same locations, what you see a lot of times is just an increase in development, an increase in education, an increase in literacy. Those are the comparisons, right, that need to be made when it comes to the material conditions of these places. Cuba, I think, is an incredible example for obvious reasons. Regardless of where they stand today in terms of actually existing socialism or whatnot, just their resilience in the face of the rest of the world over the last 60 years is, if nothing else, a testament to the strength of the socialist system.
Yeah, for sure. I'm going to get on my vegan shit in a while, but this brought to my mind, you see a lot of the carnivore influencers online or whatever will often do these protein comparisons. And they're like, how many calories are in this many grams of red meat, this many grams of, whatever. And then they'll do like quinoa in comparison. And it's like, you have to eat 2,000 calories of quinoa to equal the protein of 8 ounces of steak or whatever. And it's like, that's not an apples to apples comparison. It's inherently bad faith.
Yeah.
That was a good point that I didn't really consider. Comparing the United States to Cuba is not exactly an apples to apples comparison. Yeah. Look at Cuba compared to Cuba.
Yeah. Well, Michael Parenti has one of the best bits in numerous of his speeches and presentations where he says, just look at what came before in Cuba. Notice how all the roads went from the sugar mills to the ports and that was it. Everything else was dirt. It's that really is the comparison that needs to be made, because at the end of the day, these governments are, for the most part, supporting the people, right? Supporting the development of the people. And that might look different given the historical context in different places, but that's pretty much what it is.
Yeah.
There is no secret to building a school. There is no secret to building a hospital.
Yep.
Word.
As for the introduction, there's a couple of things in there, but really the bit that stood out to me most, so as not to harp on it for so long, is on page 19. XIX. They're talking here about having a planned economy, and they say, here too, planning will affect a reevaluation of emotional labor. Let me recontextualize that. At the top of this paragraph, they say, under socialism, productive work will be meaningful and unalienated because it will result from planning that is, from collective discussion of values, priorities, and goals. And then they say, in addition to it just being well planned so there's no work without purpose, here, too, planning will affect a reevaluation of emotional labor. The fact that we are always connected with others who depend on us and on whom we depend is featured in the ways we organize and socialize the tasks of everyday life. I think that this is an important but often undercut side of a socialist collectivization, or what have you. A planned economy can instill a kind of social and cultural revolution just because you become inherently much more connected to your fellow worker, your community, and all of that. And I just think that that's not brought to the fore
Yeah.
enough in these conversations.
Yeah, well, I think that it's a hard thing to position in the forefront for most of these discussions. I'm thinking mostly about when later on, we're going to talk about the way that they're organizing employment. And they talk about categorizing work on 3 different ways, the third of which is work that should be collectivized.
Yeah.
And if you're looking at it from an individualist perspective, it's maybe a little bit like, I don't want to sign up for community gardening or whatever.
I
Community
don't want to do the
childcare.
laundry.
Yeah, exactly. But the thing is, if we're talking about a world in which your needs are met and this is the work to be done, in the same way that you think about your work today, except that you're producing value for somebody else, right? If you actually know the person that you're producing value for, right, you know where the food in the community garden is going, you're even eating it, you're friends with the people that you're taking care of, you're delivering food to neighbors that you already care for their well-being, right? It makes that kind of work a lot more palatable, whereas when you're thinking about it in today's society, like, with all this extra shit I got to do, and then I got to go and fucking do community gardening or whatever, it's a lot less palatable to think about. So I think that you're totally right. It's completely understated. I mean, there's even a part in the crime chapter where they're saying so much of the conflict in today's society comes from the fact that we're completely disconnected, right? A conflict that if you knew the person or if you had even open communication with the person would be resolved can escalate to the point of violence in today's society. And I think that that's completely understated. It's truly important to keep in mind because, you interact differently with people that's just the fact of it, right?
Yeah.
Everybody you see on the street, for the most part, is probably a complete stranger. Knowing that person, being a part of that community would actually change that interaction, and we're talking about communitizing the fucking whole society here.
Yeah, and not to move off of domestic labor immediately, because if it weren't for how grueling the labor you have to do for capitalists is, the labor of survival is not difficult for most people to do, and a lot of people really find great gratification out of doing that work.
Totally.
People love to cook, people love to clean, they like to live in nice spaces, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's just an extension of that same idea, with the caveat that you will no longer have this overwhelming expectation of overwork where your labor is being extracted by a capitalist. You will work less and have more opportunity to do work that is actually meaningful, like cooking, cleaning, whatever.
Dude, totally. I mean, this is obviously not true for everybody, but I'm just thinking about why are chores such a chore? It's because you have to do them in the time that you otherwise would think of as free time. It's because you're thinking of time as productive and unproductive time, and you wouldn't dare do something productive in that unproductive time. Again, exactly as you said, people love to cook, people love to clean. These things are only an imposition because they're in a portion of our time that we have designated as free time. I think a lot. I need enough time for my body to stop wanting to do nothing at all. If I want to get this other shit done, I need a block of time where I can do nothing because I need to do nothing until I don't want to do nothing anymore. And that's a result of the way that we've organized our lives under capitalism. And I shouldn't say we because we didn't fucking organize it.
Yeah, we were born into it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, God, it's totally woven into all of these issues we have in society. I mean, they mentioned briefly mental illnesses in the health chapter, but how much of ADHD is wrapped up into that? I don't want to do these things right now because you're thinking about how you're using your time under capitalism. You're framing all of your usage of time under capitalism and it's driving you literally insane. So I think we are literally talking about reorganizing society right here. So if you read some of those things and you're like, I can't imagine that right now, realize that we're not talking about right now.
For sure. But I really appreciated that in the introduction. So
yeah, totally. I don't know how much we really want to talk about the stuff in chapter 1. I mean, what's the most interesting about it is the things that most people don't know. There is a rich history of socialism in the U.S. So much of U.S. history is, in fact, anti-socialism, anti-communism. And it flies in the face of the things that the U.S. stands for in its foundational documents or whatever, right? They talk about free speech. Has it ever really been free? Not if you're a communist. So I don't know. What did you have for chapter 1? Anything?
The two things that I do want to mention from the chapter are, like you said, the history of socialism in the United States. The 2 points that I had to look up that I didn't know about, because they mention in this, socialism is our history and our future. They mentioned that there was a socialist paper out of Dayton. I didn't know about that, so I looked it up. It looks like Miami Valley Socialist was a paper in the early 20th century. I actually have a PDF of a text that was written by a guy that ran Miami Valley Socialist, it sounds like. Unfortunately, his name was Joseph W. Schartz.
I'm sorry.
But
I was not expecting Schartz.
Yeah, he wrote a pamphlet called An Economic Interpretation of Local History that I'm really interested to dive into now. And then they also mention they called them utopian socialist communities. They mentioned that there were some in Ohio.
Yeah.
I looked it up. It looks like there might have been a few, but while I was looking that up, I found out that there is, I don't know if you know this, there is a town called Utopia in Ohio.
I didn't.
It was founded as an anarchist settlement.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just cool to learn history of our own area.
Yeah. You know, and the thing is, too, is that, like, socialism is woven into the history of the U.S., you already know, just in ways you don't think about. The New Deal was literally a reaction to the militant and organized struggle of communists in reaction to the Great Depression. And they talk about a lot of that in here. And I think that if you don't know that history, it is important to know. So, nice. Yeah, and of course they mention MLK and Einstein being socialists. You know, I will say, though, that I did think about here, right, that quote from MLK, call it democracy or call it democratic socialism, there must be a better distribution of wealth within this country for all God's children. When Zoran Mondani is asked about being a socialist, that's the line he uses, you know, and I think that, I mean, that's just real shit.
Yeah, the benefit of citing figures like MLK and Einstein in this conversation is that they are widely respected folks now, even though, at least in MLK's case, he was not a widely respected person at the time of his life. And so, like, it does kind of undercut any kind of pushback you get from folks when you're quoting someone that is held in such high regard.
Yeah, I didn't really have any other thoughts there.
Same. Okay, so moving on, I guess, to the Socialist Government, Chapter 2. They name a few things, you know. They want to outlaw capitalism.
Yeah.
They want to abolish the Senate. They talk about the National People's Assembly, the Assembly of Oppressed Nations, as we mentioned. They want to unionize every workplace. And then they talk about social clubs, too, which I thought was kind of cool.
Totally.
That's kind of the overview of what they're talking about in this chapter. What stood out to you about it?
Well, I think the thing that stood out to me the most in this chapter was the organization of the legislature, like they talked about. In this chapter, in the debt chapter, I was thinking a lot about one of the cons I brought up earlier, which is like, how do people get things in this system? There's a conflict I have that comes up when we're talking about what are people doing with money in this system? That was the question on my mind. You know, I guess I just don't have as fleshed out of an idea of a socialist society as I'd like, but like all of the big industries are nationalized. All of the small industries, they even say it's not necessary to nationalize small industries. There's cooperative development happening. People still want and need things, and they're still going to get things somehow, right? It seems to me that there's a market in this society still, you know, at least for small goods. The question I have, though, is like, what is the money being used for? If all your necessities are guaranteed, then why still have money? I don't know. It starts sounding a little ridiculous when I try to spell it out, but it's like, what do you spend the money on?
Yeah, well, this comes later in Chapter 6 when they're talking about housing.
Yeah.
But one of the things that they mention is obviously the distribution of housing will be guaranteed, but where you choose to live can be changed.
Sure.
And one of the things that they suggest is that you can increase your rent, the rent due to your housing,
right,
to live in a particularly sought after neighborhood or something like that. So one of the places where money can be used is to change your station, which, you know, I'm not in love with that.
But it's so strange that, like, socialist rent, I think that the way they spell out rent is actually interesting, and I don't think it's necessarily a bad solution to the kind of thing they're talking about. People want to live in different places. Rent could be the difference between the house you would normally get and the house you're getting. That goes into a fund, which is then used for the community, right? That makes sense. Sure. Okay. But I guess I'm just not seeing the bigger picture here, right? You go to your job, which is unionized, you have a say in what's being made, and then you still get paid a wage, right? And then you take the wage, you wouldn't save it necessarily, because what are you saving it for? You know what I mean? But like, what are you spending it on? Just rent, right? Better food? There's unanswered questions about the fundamental running of society. I think that this book kind of leaves unanswered.
I guess. I don't know. I mean, I wasn't thinking about it all that too deeply, but like, there is still room for commerce where there are goods that you want that are not necessities, and so that's what you spend your money on. Like,
right. But what's the impetus to sell? Say I want art, and you're an artist, right? You would sell it to me because you need the money for what?
Is that why artists sell? I mean, well, I don't think that's the only reason why things get created.
Well, yeah, but like, what's the mechanism that's causing distribution to happen, right? Are we talking? I mean, because like that seems closer to something like a barter system in that regard. You know, if you don't need the money to survive, what do you need to sell things for money?
Well, to use an example that makes some sense to me, I like making furniture. I like making guitars. I've been doing guitar projects lately. I'm becoming more of a luthier.
Nice.
But anyway, I enjoy the process of making it. I don't enjoy being surrounded by stuff that I've made to the point that I'm drowning in stuff.
Yeah, we had to walk through your hall of guitars to get here. Just kidding.
Well, and so like in this context, I would use my leisure time to make that stuff because I enjoy the process of making it, and I would get rid of it, sell it to other people because it could be useful to them or they might want it. And that would be a reason why that commerce exchange would still occur, even if I'm not driven by the profit motive.
Right, but what's the price then? Is it just the costs?
I mean, that's honestly before I started taking commissions and making furniture as like my quote unquote job.
Yeah.
That's what I was doing commissions for people that I knew and loved and cared for. It was like, you cover the cost of materials, I'll cover the quote unquote cost of labor.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. It's just a big question I had running through this is, what do you need the money for?
Yeah. It's worth thinking about that some more.
Yeah.
Because it's not going to be the same when you're not talking about manufacturing a good, especially if it's intellectual property. I don't know, that's not true either. Because, I mean, people love to write. They're going to continue to write.
Sure.
Maybe you don't have to buy their books anymore.
I think that
get them. I don't know.
I don't think that books are the best example because we have a method of distributing them without the need for real production, in the terms of the internet, right? The internet serves as a platform there in which you don't need to, there's no production cost, right? That's already rolled under the kind of universal basic service that they're talking about, internet as a right. So books, I don't know if are the best example.
There's still definitely going to be a market for physical goods, though.
Certainly.
And I was also just thinking, coming from the worlds that I come from as a comic collector, and I know a lot of toy collectors.
Yeah.
Even if those things are not being manufactured any longer, which I'm sure they would still be, but there would most definitely be a market for pre-revolution goods. Like, I really want that 91 Kenner.
Oh my God.
or whatever, you know what I mean? And so that would be another thing that collectors would be spending money on.
Yeah, I just wish that there was more discussion about the nuts and bolts of society here. Because like we kind of hinted at earlier, I don't think that an equitable system would be just nationalizing Amazon and having the people's delivery driver instead, pissing in the people's bottle, I guess,
Well, they wouldn't still have to piss in bottles. But you would have to give up your 2-day prime shipping.
Well, I mean, this is a crazy parallel, but thinking about the way that they talk about food, there wouldn't be any method that is a detriment to our current supply of food. You know what I mean? And notably, I'm sure you had on mind, right?
I have so much to say about that.
Of course, right? The production of animals. They don't even think about moving away from animal consumption. Only making it nicer. Only making it nicer.
Exactly that.
Maybe that's pointing towards a long-term dissolution of that. But, that's the kind of the thing I have in mind. Like, the structures are important in this regard because what we're talking about is, like, what society is based on. So a market is really important. How people get the goods that they need and want in the day-to-day is really important. That's the kind of thing that I would expect to be foundational in this kind of text, and I was shocked to see that it didn't show up there. I know that this chapter was about government. I didn't mean to derail us.
No, that's fine. And I glossed over my gripe about the animal agriculture problem and its harmful effects because I'm going to go all in when we get to that chapter.
Yeah.
And so I figured I would save it for that.
That's fair.
So back to the comment that I made about the way they talk about federalism in the book, and I appreciated their approach. They also mention the Constitution in this chapter, and I like what they have to say about that as well. On 28, they're talking about the U.S. Constitution and what it establishes. They write, "More important is what the Constitution does not do. It does not create any social or economic obligations of the government to the people or to society. Mm-hmm. This means that the Constitution leaves such fundamental matters as food, health, and housing up to the market, that is to say, in the hands of the class of property owners, capitalists, financiers, and landlords."
Yeah.
I thought that was a fucking great point.
Yeah, just as we talked about when we were talking about the revolution in a previous episode, the things that they had in mind when they wrote the Constitution were liberal ideas. They were these Enlightenment ideals, but they still left space for capitalism because capitalism is innate. Capitalism is part of it. And it's interesting, I think, to think about the Constitution including those rights and then having to deal with the enforcement of those things because what they're enforcing against is necessarily capitalism, the structures of capitalism that would otherwise work against those rights, like equality and justice, I guess. And so we're talking about putting into a new constitution guarantees that then ensure enforcement. Like, we're talking about housing as a right, food as a right. What that entails is that those things will be enforced upon. And it's interesting to reframe our view of the Constitution that we currently have as one that is meant to ensure the rights of capitalism. And I think that looking at it in the things that they don't cover is a really interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah, agreed.
One thing I will say from the government chapter is how they talk about professional politicians, right? I'm looking at page 26, actually. The affairs of society are too important to be delegated to professional politicians and career specialists and administrators. So they're talking about an elective principle. They're talking about immediate recall, right? That's something we've discussed a little bit before. There might be some imbalance there, but the thing is that part of this structure is the enhancement of mass democracy, right? The enhancement of mass involvement in politics, right? Of community organization. And they say, holding office in an elected position will not be a perk or privilege, but rather as an expression of sacrifice for the greater good.
Yeah.
There's something to be said about why politicians get paid. In capitalist society, the reason that politicians get paid is to prevent them from being corrupted by other money. Obviously, yeah, right. But, it's ridiculous. But that's the thing there. The reason that we pay politicians is that otherwise, right, if you're giving all your time to being a politician and you're not being compensated, you might be open for exterior compensation. But if we're talking about here changing the role of a politician to be something that is a service that you give to your community on your otherwise free time, it changes the scope of what politicians do. And I just think that kind of mass involvement in politics does have the potential to change the structure, and that's the kind of change that we're advocating for here.
Yeah, they say their government officials and civil servants at the federal, regional, municipal levels will be paid the equivalent of the average salary of a skilled worker. And they don't spell it out there, but I think it specifically should be made clear that it's the average of a skilled worker in their community, in their district, so to speak, or whatever, the community in which they serve. It's funny because years and years ago, when I was first becoming politically aware, I had this idea of a reformative policy that elected officials would only make the median wage of their district. It would be enforced that they could not make more than the median wage of a worker in their district.
Yeah.
Because I thought that had great potential to gain public support and would help, in theory, in trying the idea that you are of the people that you are serving. Now, of course, we know that would never happen. But, I don't know, it was an idea that I came to independently as an 18-year-old or whatever.
Well, it's interesting that what this makes me think of is the way that we incentivize low-income housing already, because it's the same kind of mechanism just framed in the other direction. Tax credits for low-income housing are based on you having a population that make more or less than a percentage of the median income. So we already use that kind of basis for testing of certain things. We just use it to exclude people rather than to include people.
Yeah.
I think that would be a great idea, although we're still talking about a salary. What are we talking about? What is the money being used for? Okay, that's the last time I'll say that. So, yeah.
Trying to make sense of this comment that I wrote in the margin here. I wrote Paris Commune-ass comment, and I want to know what I meant by that.
What's the context?
I'll read the bits that I have highlighted here and see if I can piece it together. Although we know that the socialist government must be centralized rather than federated, we cannot and would not want to determine in advance its precise institutional structure. I said that was a cop-out. But we can identify its core functions: securing basic political, social, and economic rights for all, managing the economy with an eye to mitigating the climate catastrophe, and guaranteeing the flourishing of the people and the planet. And then where I wrote the comment, the actual form the socialist government will take has to be determined through the application of revolutionary and democratic processes at the start of the socialist project. Okay, I know why I said that. Because there's a presumption here of no outward pressure, no counter-revolutionary pressure at this time, that they have time to work through this lengthy, labored democratic process to make these decisions at the onset, and not that they're going to immediately be overrun militarily because they're spending too much time with their fucking community councils trying to figure out if they should nationalize the banks or not.
Yeah, well, it's again the revolution-shaped hole. What happened in the context of the revolution. Yeah, I totally agree with you there.
It's just fun to piece together where my mind was at a week ago when I read that.
Yeah, so they talk about rational administrative units, right, redrawing the states. I think it's totally... I mean, it's worthwhile, right? Even the way that states are delineated now reinforces the separation between town and country, I would say. I mean, you even see that. I'm thinking about, fucking Oregon, how they have, Oregexit or something, where it's the Greater Idaho Project, where the east half of Oregon, they're so sick of being shifted blue by just Portland and fucking Salem or whatever, that they want to separate themselves and become part of Idaho so they can all vote red like they want to. It's very funny to me.
I didn't know about that.
Yeah. I don't know how big that movement really is, just to clarify, because the Cal exit, the California exit, Texas secession movements, those were all totally astroturfed fucking fake ass shit that just were online. Okay, so do you want to talk about the Assembly of Oppressed Nations?
Sure.
Well, I'll just say how they started. Socialist government has to ensure decisions impacting the entire country are taken and overseen by bodies with representation from the entire country. To this end, they envision a central socialist government that, like the current U.S. government, has two chambers. One of them would be the National People's Assembly. Similar to the House of Representatives, it's popularly elected, but it's hugely expanded. Something that I thought was really interesting was kind of the ratio here.
Yeah.
Currently, there's one representative for every 750,000 citizens in this country. That is an absurdly small number for a democracy. The parallel, in Cuba, there's one member of parliament for every 20,000 citizens. So we're talking about a massive body, right?
Yeah.
Something that's truly representative of the people. And that's what the House of Representatives was meant to be originally anyway. Now, in the place of the Senate, though, they talk about having an assembly of oppressed nations. It will consist of delegates from oppressed nationalities and peoples. To become law, proposed legislation needs to secure a majority vote in both assemblies. So there's a lot of gut reaction questions that I have about the Assembly of Oppressed Nations, but they're not questions that are unanswerable. That's the thing. I don't want to spend too much time talking about, like, who's oppressed, because I don't think it really matters, right? What we're talking about is just ensuring that there is equitable representation. You can't use population to get the Native American representation because we killed most of their population.
Yeah, they were genocided.
Yeah, so I think that kind of thing is important. Something to remember, y'all, I mean, I think about this all the time, is the fact that African Americans make up like 13% of the population. They are a minority, right?
It's like 14%.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure it's grown since I've seen that statistic last. There was a lot of scaremongering like 10 years ago that whites would no longer be the majority in the country, but that statistic was obviously flawed because what they meant was that whites would be a non-majority when compared to every other minority combined. You know, they would still have a plurality in America. The statistic that really shocked me here in the housing description was that 3/4 of white people lived in all white communities, right? Totally isolated. And that is shocking, but then I remember that most of America is white.
Well, and also there's a history of redlining and things like that that have already segregated communities historically for so long.
Yeah, totally. You know, there's a huge understanding of that has to go into whatever housing policy a socialist government implements, which they definitely talk about in this book. But it goes back to that thing, man. How would I pitch this to everyone in America?
Yeah, I get that as a reasonable question to raise when this is brought up, because it will be a realistic thing that you're going to have to face. I
think the Irish were slaves too. Irish should be represented in the Assembly of Oppressed Nations, Aaron.
Yeah.
What about Italian Americans, huh? I'm walking here.
I mean, it seems very clear that the writers of this chapter, at least, want to center Indigenous and Black folks as the voices of being heard in the Assembly of Oppressed Nations, because so much of what we know as America is built on the genociding and enslavement of Indigenous and Black folks.
Yeah.
And that makes historical sense. I think that that's an argument that holds water. Not everyone's going to hear it, and everyone that doesn't can fuck off.
Yeah.
Is my opinion.
Well, sure. I mean, I am in agreement. That's the thing, is like, I think that this is a good idea, structurally speaking. I'm just thinking about its implementation, you know, and I'm not trying to get bogged down in that.
Yeah. What I do think is an interesting way, another kind of caveat to that conversation, is related to what we talked about last time with land back, and they do bring that up a little bit here as well, is like, effectively, the authors of this text are advocating for honoring the treaties that were previously agreed to as like our first set of, you know, reparations, a good faith reparation made toward the indigenous peoples of this land.
Yeah.
And once that happens, how is that going to change the kind of conversation around the Assembly of Oppressed Nations? Because that will change the power dynamic for sure. They're going to effectively control much more of the literal land in that way than they do currently. They'll still be historically oppressed, historically do reparations and all of that, but, you know, it just kind of changes the dynamic in an interesting way.
Yeah, it's impossible to try to think that. I mean, it's a crazy thought experiment, you know? Because first off, I don't even know what those fucking lines look like. If we're talking about honoring all of those treaties, let me see a map. Do we need to move every white guy back across to the east side of the Mississippi? No, I mean, no, obviously. But, you know, if we're talking about treaties written in fucking 1838 or earlier, what does that really look like? Yeah,
there's also an interesting question there about, I guess I'm thinking purely of Hawaii. I mean, because they do mention that protectorates like Guam and Puerto Rico will be given sovereignty and citizenship.
Which they should already.
Exactly. But like a place like Hawaii that was effectively colonized and stolen by the United States
Literally
as well.
stolen.
Yeah. Like, how does that factor into this conversation, the Assembly of Oppressed Nations?
Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't even necessarily know if this is like a question worth posing, but if we're talking about transferring control of a large area to a people that are now hugely diminished, is that really fair to say, like, here, this is all yours now, good luck? Like, I think that there's a more inclusive structure that's necessary. I mean, it's one of mutual understanding, honestly.
Yeah, I think where the, quote, fairness comes from is those folks would have an opportunity to be a part of the conversation about what the land use is going to be now in this context.
They actually have a fucking voice,
Yeah.
you know? Yeah, totally fair. Okay, so energy, future, people, and the planet.
Yeah. So just broad strokes, what they talk about in this chapter, they kind of have a three-pronged approach that energy needs to be decommodified, decolonized, decarbonized.
Boom.
They talk about cap and adapt, or what they kind of changed to the cap and convert plan, which is already in existence. They're like, just do that.
That's right.
Do this plan.
Yeah. The thing is that we have a picture for how to fix climate change right now. It just requires not market forces. You know, it requires us to step outside the anarchy of the market, right? It requires war communism. I mean, it requires the kind of like broad sweeping things that are incompatible with our current system and profit motive.
Yeah, to that point on 45, they say capitalism can't provide a solution to the climate crisis because capitalism is the crisis. Capitalist production always and necessarily places profit over people and the planet.
Yes. The three big points: decommodify, decolonize, decarbonize, right? I think those are the biggest sticking ones. The one that might be the most tenuous is honestly decolonize, but when you start looking at what that actually means, it's easy to understand. So much of the effects of climate change are being pushed onto marginalized communities, not only within the United States, but also outside of the United States, right? I mean, again, we're exerting our global influence through the vectors of climate change, and we're pushing that onto essentially the third world.
Yeah, the global south. They mention that.
South.
They say capitalism pretends that markets provide the mechanisms for dealing with the climate catastrophe when markets are really a way to redistributing negative effects of global heating onto racialized and colonized people.
Yeah, totally. They make an interesting note in the decolonizing energy as well about indigenous knowledge. That's something I really appreciated. And I'm always curious about that conversation, right? What is the extent of indigenous knowledge when applied to today? I don't know. I'm curious about indigenous knowledge. If you have a good recommendation on that, you can let us know at leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com.
Yeah, would love to get recommendations on that. And like mentioned before, anything that talks about land back.
I mean, that was one really interesting note in here was about how West African slaves originally brought over our knowledge for cultivation of rice. And then that knowledge was essentially taken from them, and then just slavery continued.
Yep.
So there's a lot to be said there. But one other thing is that on that same page 49, there's a bit of degrowth in this. The American way of life is ridiculous, right? The U.S. practices of overconsumption do not provide a social model for the rest of the world. 5 Earths would be needed. 5 Earths. 5 Earths. 5 Earths would be needed if everyone on the planet consumed as much as the average American.
It's fucking crazy.
Yeah, that's insane.
That is a stat, to answer your question from earlier on, that is a stat that I was like, oh shit, I didn't know that.
5 Earths. Yeah. I mean, I've definitely said this before, but like, walk down a fucking Walmart, look at something on the shelf and consider what it took to make and produce that. So much of it, in fact, that it could be distributed over the entire nation to fill a Walmart shelf. Your little fucking plastic tinker toy, man. There's a whole factory. Thousands of people are employed in the process of making that doodad. So you can give it to your kid. They can play with the box for 2 months and then throw it in a toy chest and never touch it again.
Yeah. I always think about that existentialist comics tweet that I'll paraphrase where it's like, it's crazy that people in the United States think freedom means choosing between 49 barbecue sauces versus actually having the freedom to dictate your life.
Dude, even Bernie, he was like, Americans do not need 42 Barbie dolls, you know? Yeah. So, I don't know. There's just a lot to be said there. And it goes back to that point I had, too, about, like, are we just nationalizing these industries and keeping it all the same, right? I don't know, man. Are we going to have a socialist collective of toy makers that decommodify our toy line so our kids aren't influenced into liberal bourgeois individualism anymore?
Yeah. I will say they start to talk about environmental racism a little bit around page 49 and 50. I highly recommend a book called A Terrible Thing to Waste on environmental racism. Pretty good.
Hell yeah. Something that struck me was I mean, I know that we rely heavily on fossil fuels, but like looking at the graph opposite of 54, it's a chart of the U.S. greenhouse gas emissions in 2020. Okay, electricity makes up 25% of our emissions, but the most stark thing is that half of that electricity generation, emission generation, comes from coal.
Cool.
Half. Okay. The craziest thing is this, though. Coal only produces 20% of our electricity. It's like literally a net loss. Why do we still use it? Because it's profitable.
Mm-hmm.
That's literally it. Now, there is one thing I'll say here is that they talk about moving away from fossil fuels, and they also talk about moving off of nuclear. I don't know. Do you have any strong feelings about nuclear energy?
I don't.
I don't either, except that I think it's good.
Yeah. My understanding is that it's safer than the propaganda would lead you to believe, that it is more efficient than things like coal.
Yeah.
And so it's probably something that we should do.
What's interesting to me is that so much of the conversation against nuclear energy has to do with the waste, right? Well, really, it's two main facets. One is the maintenance and one is the waste. And I think that the maintenance, that one's easy to get around. We're talking about people that give a shit here. These are all nuclear enthusiasts that are running the nuclear plant, and they all love it.
Well, when the profit motive isn't the incentive, you will actually take care of the thing rather than cutting costs as much as possible to incentivize profit more than anything.
Right. Just like what happened in Chernobyl. They were following the profit motive there. No, I'm sorry. I was being an asshole.
I was thinking of 3 Mile Island, I guess, but yeah.
No, I was just being a shithead. No, I think that the maintenance is not a sincere concern. If we're talking about reorganizing society with the profit motive, I think that that's covered, right? But the other part, I think, is also covered. I think that if we have a globally cooperative understanding of society, that can factor in something like waste management. Mm-hmm. And I also don't know how much, like when people think about nuclear waste, they have a pretty outdated idea of what that means in their mind. I just think that there's more around it. I don't know if I'm necessarily willing to discount nuclear so quickly.
Yeah, I'm admittedly quite ignorant on it. I do know that the Emilio Estevez Charlie Sheen vehicle Men at Work deals with toxic waste being dumped into our water.
Yeah.
And I don't like that.
Man. Yeah, I don't know.
One question that I had here that they don't address because it wasn't advanced enough at this point, I guess. On page 54, they say, thankfully, the world's entire population can flourish on much less energy than the U.S. currently uses. A recent study found that global energy consumption in 2050 could be reduced to the levels of the 1960s while still providing what it describes as a decent life for all, despite a global population in 2050 that is estimated to be 3 times larger than that of the 1960s. Mm-hmm. And the question I have, 5 years after this was written was, how does AI factor into that? Yeah. Because AI is a climate catastrophe machine.
Sure. And
automation and AI is something that can be used to reduce the need for labor and increase productivity. But is there a way to do it in a way that's environmentally sound? I don't know. I was just thinking about that.
I think the answer is yes. That's the thing.
I'm not sure that the answer is yes. Just water consumption alone.
I don't know. See, that I have not read enough to understand that. A lot of those issues when it comes to AI are because we're living under capitalism. I think that these things, the reason we're seeing them affect the environment in such a way is because they're allowed to. I don't see why the same kind of technological development couldn't happen under socialism. It would just be slower, if anything. Say we fucking convert our whole grid, we decarbonize, decolonize, and decommodify energy. What's to stop us from then using some of that energy for AI?
My gut reaction was to start thinking of it in a credit system type way, not literally, but if we reduce emissions from all these other, or reduce energy use from all of these other mechanisms, then that leaves room for AI to use that energy. But that also, I don't think, is a particularly good attitude to take long term. You know what I mean?
I think as AI stands now, I think it's more important to hold that critical attitude. But I think that if we're talking about the utilization of AI under these structures, I think it's possible.
Maybe.
I'm not willing necessarily to discount it. I'm a little more techno-optimistic, I think. Just because
That's true. That's certainly true.
I think it could be organized collectively. Because the main issue with AI is how it's being utilized. That comes from top down. It's profit-driven. If we had a cooperative body determining how AI was utilized in our day-to-day life, it could be used for things that increase productivity and decrease our working time.
Okay, I'll accept that, because I think a large part of where I also have an ethical stance against AI are things we've talked about previously, where it's required to use the intellectual labor of others, and it is allowed to steal the intellectual labor of others in order to generate images or language models or whatever the fuck. And I don't think that that should be allowed, but if a cooperative of people decides that, like, yeah, we're not going to use AI to make fucking 40 pictures of elf versions of Donald Trump or something like that, then I'm more okay with it.
I think it's just a matter of how it's used. That's kind of how I feel about AI overall. And I mean, I think as it currently stands, it's shit and ass.
Yeah.
But I think that there's something interesting about intellectual property to be said on a much larger scale than just art or writing. They talk about it a little bit in the last chapter, in the global facing chapter, right? But they're talking about distributing our technologies freely, you know? It's not explicitly stated, but part of that comes with a relaxation of intellectual property rights. And when you think about the impetus for intellectual property being allowing people to commercialize their own ideas in a way that sparks innovation or whatever, then I think that it makes much more sense to think about easing it in a future where things are more equally distributed, people's needs are taken care of, they don't need to commercialize and commodify their intellectual property in order to survive.
That's a very fair point. Like, you know, as an illustrator, for example, who fucking gives a shit if someone across the world uses your illustration to make a t-shirt for themselves? You are not at a loss in that context. You are at a loss in this context because they're commodifying your labor and effectively, you know, stealing the potential that you have to survive through that commodification. But when that's no longer necessary, then who fucking cares?
Yeah.
Other than some weird ego-driven position where it's like, but I drew that.
This is mine.
Yeah. But I think the social relations around all of that will be so shifted at that point that it will probably look entirely different anyway.
Yeah, that's kind of where I stand. I mean, because, like, I don't know, people already do that with fucking fan fiction and shit.
Yeah, that's fair.
All right. Anything else for energy? Green capitalism is a myth, unless green, of course, refers to money. Okay, so debt. Well, pretty simple answer to this one. Debt, get rid of it.
Yeah, abolition and reconstruction are the two primary tenets here.
Yeah, I think that this chapter in particular does some of the ideological lifting in the fact that they're talking about the abolition of private property. They're pretty gung-ho about it. In fact, matter of fact, I love is that the final line? It's no, sorry, on
precisely.
That's exactly the one. On 69, right? The bankers, credit card companies, and financiers will complain that they aren't getting what they're owed, but we owe them nothing. And when they say, quote, but this will destroy the entire basis of private property, we will smile and nod. Precisely.
Yeah.
That's great. That's great. It's true, right? They use debt as a form of imperialism. They use debt as a form of discrimination, right? It's another method of control. We ask people to educate themselves, and then we also ask them to put themselves into debt for that education. I mean, it's this totally insane system, and I think that, I don't know, you know? I don't have an argument against the abolition of debt as it stands, and I think that, to slash through the Gordian knot and destroy this method of control for private property is, in fact, a step towards the abolition of private property. And I think that that's a good thing.
Yeah, agreed. And two quick points that I think are strengths of the way that this book is written that I didn't really bring up. We didn't really talk about previously. One is exemplified in this chapter. Like, they bring up the notion of postal banking as an example.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a good encapsulation of how they're using the ideas that they're proposing are by and large not out of whole cloth or completely imagined. They are things that have been proven to work in certain contexts, and they're saying, let's expand the use of this premise. Postal banking being a really good example of that.
I mean, gosh, even the fact that, like, not only does every other industrialized nation basically offer some form of free or subsidized healthcare, but, like, we also did, right? University of Florida didn't charge residents tuition until the 70s. The City University of New York was free until the 70s also. These things are possible.
Yeah, and secondarily, another example of where I think that they do a good job of bringing up a contradiction of capitalism that maybe isn't readily apparent to everyone. In the context of debt, on 64, they say the state is also deeply involved in finance in ways that exceed the Fed. Regulations, laws, and policies impact borrowing decisions from the individual to the international level. For example, the so-called free market didn't decide that student loans were ineligible for bankruptcy protection, but business loans are. They're presenting a very clear contradiction in a way that the working class people are being marginalized and oppressed under the thumb of capitalism. That should make clear, perfect sense to the average person.
Yeah, we already plan our economy. We just do it in favor of the rich.
Yeah,
you know?
The externalities of that are being socialized, but like the profits are being privatized.
Yeah, they use that line a couple of times in here where the risk is socialized, but the reward is privatized, you know, and I just think that's so true. So, you know, we could do it better. God, the second largest. I love that. It's just like the two largest forms of debt are one, mortgage debt, and then two, student loan debt. You know, just get rid of it. So much of our fucking economy is an Excel spreadsheet anyway. Okay, I know I've said that before, but like, it's just true.
One little bit of pushback, I guess. They're talking about occupations on 77 and how socialist planning guarantees a workforce. And they say people will not choose occupations just, quote, for the money as they do under capitalism. They will make choices based on their interests, skills, and general social need. And while I think that that is more likely the case under this socialist reconstruction than it is under capitalism, I think the proposed system of rents that they present does still incentivize, to a degree, picking an occupation for the wage that is presented.
Yeah.
It may not be the only reason you pick that occupation, but it's like, I want to live in this larger house rather than the bungalow that I've been provided, rather than the apartment that I've been provided or whatever. So I'm going to choose an occupation that presents me a higher wage. There's still a factor of that there that I think that they're just like, nah, that won't exist.
It's part of the inequity of the market, man.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why that structure is so important to talk about. I will say, though, that I think that the way they put it is too black and white. I think that a better way to look at it is to think of the fact that all of those things, you don't choose an occupation just for the money right now. You do choose it based off of your skills, your interests, and your needs. It's just that the possibilities are so much more limited under capitalism because there is an additional constraint of the fact that you must sell your labor to survive. You know, even if we're thinking about it in a transitional sense, having the opening up of that marketplace of job availability to be based more so on what you want to do and less so on the profit changes things. I think that that's part of it too.
I think the lifestyle that is afforded by an occupation is a large part of the consideration on why a lot of people pursue it. I want doctors to love medicine, to be interested in helping and healing their communities.
Yeah.
I don't want doctors that love having a Mercedes, and that's why they're a doctor. You know what I mean?
Well, I think it goes into how they classify the jobs, right? I mean, they do I'm looking at 76, right? They say that work is classified into three broad categories: professional expertise, socially necessary tasks, and shared responsibilities. So even in the grand scale, when we're thinking about shitty jobs, they're already talking about phasing those jobs out to a collective responsibility anyway. So the two jobs that remain would be ones that people pursue because they love, and then ones that people can be trained into, and they don't have to stay for their entire lives, you know? So I still think that there's a lot of potential for that. I think that they're trying to minimize the profit motive for becoming a doctor in that way.
Yeah.
Although I absolutely agree with you that the way that they have a market structure for commodity distribution is still leading to some of those issues.
Yeah, it doesn't erase the issue, even if it does, mitigate it to a degree.
I don't know. I don't want to lean so heavily into the fact that it's a transitional program, but I'm curious to see what they would say is a more long-term effect of this kind of system.
Yeah, that's an interesting open question.
Yeah.
Okay, one other kind of gripe from this. It's the last thing I have for this chapter.
Okay.
Before I go ham on the next chapter. On 78, they bring up people's development banks. And this is an example of my gripe about top-down versus bottom-up. I just don't understand, and I don't feel that they do an adequate job of describing how those conflicting interests can coexist. As an example, on the bottom of 78, they're talking about the new socialist system will expand postal banks into a network of people's development banks, taking on the planning aspect of finance, its role in allocating social wealth to specific projects. These banks will help communities determine how to prioritize and what to support. If a new school is built, will repairs on the water treatment plant need to be put off for another year? How much will music and theater groups be granted for their artist development programs, et cetera, right? And that is the sort of thing that makes perfect sense when you just read it, but then when you start thinking, if you have national interests, for example, rebuilding infrastructure that will require resources. Let's say there was a particularly violent revolution and it destroyed the interstate system to the point that it's going to be a large national undertaking in order to repair it, presuming we decided that that's something that we want to pursue, right? That's a national interest that is going to have very clear top-down priority with the way resources are being allocated. But if you're in a community that's untouched by that interstate system and you need a new school or whatever, you have a clear priority for that new school to get those resources. And there's going to be a conflict there. It's not an infinite supply of whatever these resources are.
Sure.
And I just don't think that they do an adequate job of spelling out how that conflict is going to be resolved.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, right? Are they assuming that it's just like democratically central? Like it's centrally resolved like that? Everyone comes together and discusses and then they take a vote on it?
Yeah, but if there's a national council that's made up of all of these small community councils,
Yeah.
the small community council's going to vote in favor of what is most beneficial to them, probably. And the national council is probably going to vote on what is most beneficial to the most people. And so there's still going to be some sort of conflict there where it's the oppression of the majority of the minority by the majority. You know what I mean? I don't know. I don't mean to make it seem like a deal-breaking big deal, but it's something that I feel like didn't get addressed that is a pretty clear criticism of the Soviet system, for example.
Sure.
That I would have liked to have seen more spelled out.
Yeah, I'm thinking about even on a local level, right? Like a high school, like if it's two departments, two positive things, not necessarily warring in any way except for the fact they're competing for the same resources. Is it just collectively determined and then they just follow that to the end? I don't know.
I just feel like leave it to them to decide is too much of a hand wave for me.
Yeah.
Especially when there are competing interests.
Sure.
Yeah, okay, agriculture. I have strong feelings on this chapter.
Yeah.
I'm just going to fucking go in.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so largely I think they need to go all the way with the argument. It is quite clear that they are against the industrial agricultural system, and they spell out a lot of the reasons why that is, largely because of its impact on the climate crisis.
Yep.
And that is correct, but they're not taking the argument to its logical conclusion, in my opinion. So, broad strokes, they want to nationalize the land, and they use the Central Land Bureau and the Department of Food Production to decide all of this sort of shit. It must be vegan. Here's my position. The Department of Food Production must be vegan. I would argue that you can't claim to care about climate change and not be vegan. They talk about a plant-based diet later in the book as like a positive thing. They say on 125, there is clear evidence that a plant-based diet can help reverse hypertension, diabetes, and other diseases. So they're talking about it from a medical position as being advantageous. And there are some pleasantries throughout this chapter about reducing animal suffering or reducing harm. They have
getting rid of CAFOs,
But I feel like they're missing the forest for the trees here. Here's what we know to be true. 75% of the land currently being used for agriculture would be eliminated if we eliminated animal agriculture. If we are no longer using that for grazing and pasture land, 75% of global agricultural land can be collectivized and reused and redistributed for other needs, not to mention the reduction in emissions that comes from that. You're going to see a destruction of wildlife cut by 66%, water use cut by 54%, both things that are important for us ecologically if we're thinking long term. I wrote a little note to myself here about quote-unquote organic meat and pasture-raised meat, like people that argue things about like more quote-unquote ethical animal raising. That's greenwashing. It's actually more destructive to the climate to have agriculture that uses that. There have been studies that prove that. They bring up corn and soy as the two most heavily subsidized agricultural goods in the United States, which is true, and that's because they're used for fucking animal feed. 97% of soy that is produced in the United States is used for animal feed.
I think they mentioned that in here, that it's for animal feed.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Like, so the natural conclusion, no longer use animals for food, no longer commodify living creatures for food, and we will eliminate the need for all of that. And yet again, this comes back to the reduction of land use. That is more land that can be used for all of the other shit that needs to happen in the United States. Lastly, I would argue that the domination of nature is fundamentally anti-socialist, and we just got to accept that.
I mean, the thing is that I totally agree with you, and I don't have an argument against that, except that they're talking transitionally. But they don't spell out a goal in the future of getting rid of this kind of production. That's the thing.
Yeah.
So I think it's totally reasonable to have that in mind. I don't know, they talk about like a reduction of what we consume. They talk about a change in the way that we do our farming. They talk about going from industrial farming to like something that's agroecological. And even if that requires an increase in manual labor, it's worth it because of our degrowth, essentially, right? Our deconsumption. And so I think that I agree with you, but I don't know how it factors into this kind of change because I don't think they have that in mind.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think they have that in mind. I think my point is that I think they obviously should. I do appreciate the stuff like on 82, they're talking about diminishing animal suffering.
Yeah.
I appreciate that that's something that they're talking about, though. If I can dive deep into my vegan shit, on 92, they use this line that really fucking got to me. They say, agroecological systems also involve working with local communities to ensure that food is produced in fair and sustainable ways that tend to be more labor-intensive than industrial labor-saving systems. That word fair really fucking stuck in my craw, because I don't think there's a fair way to slit a cow's throat. I don't think there's a fair way to enforceably impregnate a dairy cow or steal her calf from her. I don't think there's a fair way to gas a pig. I think it's like you either want it one way or you don't. I obviously have very strong feelings about it. I think it's quite clear which way it should be.
I think that that's fair.
A point I made last year, I made a video about like why I think veganism and communism are
Aligned.
compatible. Yeah, aligned. And one of the things that I mentioned, I was happy to see that they brought up in this text on 92, is that like the labor force around animal agriculture is super exploited. And like if you are an advocate for workers and workers' rights, then like abstaining from animal agriculture is one way to help support that. They bring up on 92 that suicide rates are 3.5 times higher among U.S. farmers than the general population. That is to say nothing of modern agriculture's seasonal reliance on super exploited and unfree immigrant labor.
Yeah, not to mention they were all hothouses for COVID and disease.
Yep.
Yeah, not only in humans, but also in fucking animals.
Yep. So I did really appreciate them bringing that up.
Yeah, I mean, we're aligned here. So much of our food system is completely fucked. It needs to be completely changed in so many ways that are completely antithetical to the market, completely antithetical to the capitalist system.
Yeah.
And it's daunting to look at. To even think then on top of that about animal liberation is like paralyzing.
It's such a seismic shift, and I'll accept a deferment.
Deferment. Sorry.
Well, like to say like this is a transitional stage, that would be too seismic a shift to jump into completely. I can accept that with a logical plan to see it happen.
Yeah.
But I really don't like that they don't even, they're like breezing right past the conclusion.
Yeah, no, I think that's totally worthwhile. And I don't see any reason not to is the thing. Like, I think it's worth pointing towards this, even if it's as an ultimate goal. Because we're talking about, like you said, the domination of nature, the roots of oppression. The way that we structure our society is based on the things we consume, the way we produce those things. Part of that is meat. Part of that is our consumption of animals, our oppression and domination of animals. So yeah, I would have liked to see a little more of that there, but
for sure.
Hey, whatever. It's not like this is a hugely hypothetical book with radical long-term shifts in our society or anything like that.
I'll leave it at that for this chapter if there's anything else.
No, I think that was really all I had there. I don't know. By the end of the book, just to be honest, I started getting department fatigue. I don't care about the People's Department of blank.
Yeah.
Like, okay, I get that that's your answer. I don't know. I think when they started to get into like the line by line, each line item, I started to lose a little bit of the fervor I started this book with.
I would agree. It gets a little tiring. Like we said at the beginning, it's the answer to every question is collectivize. So it's like, what is the department that you're developing in order to answer this question or serve this need? Chapter 6, it's the National Housing Agency. I was interested to see that they have a 2-home cap. So like you said with the Soviets, you can have a vacation home in our socialist reconstructed United States. And there were a couple of interesting things here. On 108, I thought it was funny. Since lawns are one of the largest irrigated and most heavily fertilized crops in the U.S., the National Housing Agency will guide their transformation into communal recreation areas and native plant gardens.
Yeah.
So fuck your lawn. I thought that was funny. I agree, but it's just a funny thing to say.
I don't know. There's something that I've had in mind for a long time about like what an ideal agricultural system looks like. It's really the competition between like a large decentralized plan, a decentralized system. Everyone has fucking communal gardens and whatnot, and then more centralized, like large collective farming operations, And it's interesting to think about in a modern context because we have so much food already. If we were to take all the food that we have currently and distribute it, we could feed everybody. The problem is that all of these systems that are in place are hugely destructive on our health, on our environment, on a lot of things. So the question really is, like where is the split? How much does this need to be restructured and still be able to feed people? When they say that we won't engage in any transition that threatens our food supply, part of me is a little wary of that statement because it's like, What if it always is threatened? What if that is the problem? Like, what if that is the block stopping us from making these changes? You know, is that we're so worried about our food supply? I mean, like, bread is the first conquest. You know, like, bread is the first thing that needs to be dealt with, right? If people are not fed, then the revolution will fail. That's a guarantee. So I'm just keeping that in mind. How do we ensure that food is a guarantee for everybody, and also change it in such a way that it is not also a threat to our lives outside of the realm of food?
Yeah, what you said there made me think a little bit about, in the context of this chapter on housing and transportation, you know, it gets thrown around all of the time, the stats about how many vacant homes there are. What is it, 13 vacant homes for every houseless person in the United States?
Like that.
Something like that, yeah. And so, like, given the context of the infrastructure that already exists, the easy answer is redistribute all of that property, right? Like, abolish private property and redistribute it among the people. But that's not the most ecologically sound thing to do. That's not the way to make the best use of, say, your lawn, for example. Like, the smartest way probably to plan a community is to have one central shared public space where there is the community garden, there is the place for play or, you know, recreation or whatever, and then all of your homes are surrounding that shared space. But that's not the way that the United States is laid out right now. Right. And so, like, which lane is it? Are we going to occupy homes that already exist, or are we going to reconfigure everything about the way that infrastructure exists?
Yeah,
I think there's a viable reason to do both. Yeah, or either.
I think that there's something in that, because they say, even in this chapter, the housing chapter, they say on page 106, there is no one-size-fits-all housing arrangement, from single people to large groups, people who like to move around and those who prefer to stay in the same place. There must be a wide array of available housing possibilities. The inventory and survey process will bring planning directly to the people, demystifying resource allocation, right? The National Housing Agency, the People's Department of National Housing, immediate priority will be to end houselessness and housing insecurity. You know, so it's like, as long as the goal that is in mind is that food is a right, housing is a right, you know, we can still move forward and make some of these changes. But yeah, I am still wary. One thing that kind of pushes back on that thought, though, is that on 114, I really appreciated that they say simply, we'll change buying local from a niche matter of bourgeois taste it is today into an obvious, convenient, and practical way of living for everybody. Yeah. In the longest term, that kind of local consumption is better for us as a society. You know, the question is simply, can we replicate that at such an extent that everybody is fed, everybody is guaranteed food as their right?
Yeah, and I pose that question about which is the lane we're going to take as a long-term question, because I do recognize that in the short term, the answer is the priority is people should be housed, people should be fed, so we do what needs to be done to make that happen. Yeah. And so it is likely going to be, in the case of housing, seize the housing, get people homes, and then start planning communities. Yeah. And like you said, not every community will be planned in exactly the same way, so there is a variety for all of the different types of folks that there are. Some people don't like to live in the same place their entire life. Yeah. Some people will never want to leave their child at home, you know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. Before we move off this chapter, there's one shocking fact on 109, and it's that there's almost twice as much parking in the fucking U.S. as there is housing.
Yeah.
What the fuck? You know, there's almost 8 spaces per car. Do you know a person that owns 8 cars?
No.
Okay, that's ridiculous, right? I mean, you can see it on fucking Google Maps. The amount of space taken up by parking is ridiculous, insane. I mean, they say it in the book, but the U.S. forces you to have a car, essentially. I mean, I grew up in Atlanta, man. You could not get around that city unless you had a car. Yeah. I spent so much money on Bird. So much money on Bird scooters.
Yeah. There are 2 stats on 111 that stood out to me, too. The average household spends 16 cents of every dollar on transportation, and then commuters in the most congested cities lose up to a week a year stuck in traffic.
Yeah, you missed the most important part of that first statistic. Out of that 16 cents, 93% goes to buying, maintaining, and operating cars. Yeah. Okay? What the fuck? The streets used to be for people. Yeah. Right? I mean, jaywalking was invented by the car companies, essentially. I mean, it's fucking ridiculous. Take our streets back, goddammit. Yeah.
There was one little bit of pushback that I had from this chapter. On 112, they're talking about the new People's Department of Transportation and how they'll prioritize public transportation services and easily accessible routes between workplaces, blah, 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 blah. These services and routes will be marked first for upgrades and repairs. Hybrid and electric buses and vans will be built and supplied for short routes. Yeah, okay, that's all well and good, except if we are also decolonizing our energy. We're still getting cobalt and coltan from Congo. Yep. That's how those hybrid vehicles are being manufactured. What does that look like? I'm not so quick to say that it's going to be readily available to us if we are decolonizing our attitude in every capacity.
Yeah, I think I agree with you there. I don't know, I just think that's the kind of thing that'll have to be resolved from our new global standing. If we're talking about the rest of the world, then, I'm trying to imagine who the main consumer is of, like, Congolese cobalt, right? How much of a percentage of that is the U.S.? You know what I mean? If we're nationalizing these industries with an eye on a socialist production, something that's for the needs of humanity, something that's anti-imperialist, something that's literally restructuring our relationship with the rest of the globe, then I think it'll change those things necessarily. There is an aspect of this conversation that has to do with degrowth at its core. And it's that, like our level of consumption, as the book already said, it would take 5 Earths if the rest of the world consumed like us. We need to change those things. I'm just thinking about mutual understanding again, honestly, because our relationship with the Congo and their development, their extraction of cobalt, it will be changed by our changing.
For sure.
That's just really how I feel about it, because who really is the biggest threat on the global scale, right? Who really is got their finger in every fucking pie? It's the United States.
Yeah.
So if we're talking about cutting the head off the snake, we're literally talking about changing the single largest imperialist force in the globe to be something that is socially aligned, then why wouldn't that also change our relationship with the rest of the globe? That's what I think there. We're the biggest consumer of cobalt. I'm sure the second biggest is China. Mm-hmm. And their production of things that use cobalt is at least partially to meet our demand. It's part of the global economy, the global consumption of smart electronics, things that primarily use cobalt. A large portion of that is in the United States. It actually reminds me of the fucking war on drugs. All this drug production in the South comes from our demand for drugs. If we're thinking about the production of a harmful resource or something along those lines, right? I think that's not a bad parallel.
Yeah, in that context, I'm thinking a lot about the United States as the consumer culture. And so you eliminate that consumerism, or at least strongly reduce that level of consumerism, it changes the way the global market is going to react.
Yeah.
And also the idea that we mentioned from the introduction that, like, the United States shifting into a socialist construction does not solve the global problem of imperialism, but being a thought leader, or whatever the fuck you want to call it, will certainly change the conversation in a way that is certainly meaningful.
Yeah.
In the same way, even when you zoom down to a single issue like Congolese cobalt.
Right. Yeah, totally. And the thing too is that, putting aside the fact that cobalt is a rare resource, it's a scarce resource, if we're lending development to the rest of the world as well, if we're sharing our technologies, our resources, our productive forces, right, then wouldn't that also change the way that cobalt is extracted, right? The way that these industries that we think of as ultra exploitative in the global south, if we're literally changing the relationship between the seller and buyer here, we're changing it from one where it has to be this ultra extractive race to the bottom kind of thing, fucking child labor and all of that in the south and these unregulated labor markets, wouldn't that also change? Why are we still assuming that there would be this, it's like we still have children mines down in the fucking, the blood diamond mines or whatever. It's like that clearly would also be changed. That production would also be realigned to be something that is socially beneficial.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
I guess the Congo thing just sticks out to me so much because I'm harping on it because so much of the way, I guess this is mostly a DemSoc thing, so maybe I'm being unfair to PSL in this case, but like harp on new technology and the use of like electric cars as an example. And that's why we started talking about this in the first place, because they're talking about transportation systems being electrified,
right.
To be more energy efficient as a response to the climate crisis. But that also comes with a very serious cost.
Yep.
I don't want to export the suffering like the Nordic model would allow.
Right. We'll just build our beautiful social democracy PSL style, and then the rest of the world is as it already was.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally get that. But as well as the revolution inside of the U.S. goes unsaid, I think it also goes unsaid outside of the U.S. in this book. Because if the U.S. were to become socialist, even like how China is, I think it would drastically change our relationship with the rest of the world.
Oh, yeah. And you would hope it would be the spark that fires the flame.
I would hope so, you know? God, I don't think that Britain and France necessarily have the power to overturn us, to overturn our veto. Shit. Honestly, I'm thinking about the beginning of the PRC, because they had all of those international struggles where they wanted to assume China's seat at the UN. And for a long time, I think for like 20 years, it actually went to Taiwan. China's seat on the councils went to Taiwan instead, and it was a big international thing. But like, I know we've already talked about the UN being totally rebuilt or whatever. Like, it can be on that foundation, but it should truly be what the UN was originally made for. The US already holds the primary seat there. Yeah, it is unequal in our favor, right? But if the US were to change hands to socialist power, that force could, in theory, be used for good.
Yeah.
I would obviously be in favor of changing those systems to be more equitable regardless. I mean, I think the fact that we have a limitless single vote veto on any issue is pretty fucking ridiculous. Like, the idea of the Security Council and all of that is kind of crazy. And you can see that play out through the Cold War and all of that too. But if the US were to take a socialist charge and still hold these positions it does in international bodies, I think that would also make a significant difference on a global scale.
For sure.
Okay.
So that's transportation. Chapter 7 is medicine for the people. They seem really taken by the Cuban polyclinic model, which seems to be the foundation that they've built this whole thing on.
Yeah.
The People's Health Administration. And of course, there's a different office for every different thing.
The nicest thing about this chapter for me is that it's so within reach. Not necessarily the polyclinic idea, although there are like urgent cares everywhere.
Yeah.
You know, if we were to take all of our current standing healthcare systems and roll them into one centralized, well-organized body under a People's Health Administration or whatever, then yeah, I'm sure we could achieve something similar when it comes to local care. But really the thing that I was just thinking about Medicaid for All. Mm-hmm. Like, the fact that we can currently provide socialized healthcare to everybody that needs it.
We could very easily.
Yeah.
And 90% of the frustration that people have with going to the doctor is because of insurance.
Absolutely.
Insurance butts in at every single step.
Yeah.
If you're reducing that to one single administration, I mean, you could argue about the bureaucracy slowing it down or whatever, but you're eliminating 5 middlemen every single time you're trying to do something.
Yeah. You know, imagine that, right? That's the thing, is that going to the doctor shouldn't be transactional. Going to the doctor shouldn't be competitive like on an insurance market. Going to the doctor should be something that is anxiety-free, something that is supported, something that is regular, something that is natural, right? Something that shouldn't be another anxiety on your life, right? Yeah. Oh, I've just suffered some kind of injury. You shouldn't have to put that off. You should be able to go and seek medical care if you think you need it. Why is that such a financial burden on us? Well, it's because of profit. That's super straightforward, and it's something that we could change yesterday.
Yeah, and part of that they address is through abolishing drug patents, which would completely dismantle the pharmaceutical industry in this country, which is chef's kiss, exactly what needs to happen.
Yeah, I mean, God, they talk a lot about the COVID vaccines here, and I think that that's such a critical thing, because when you think about what allowed the COVID vaccine to be developed, it was the forces of the government. I mean, it was like Operation Warp Speed, for all of Trump's flaws, did succeed in creating a vaccine in record time. I mean, it's not that that's impossible outside of our fucking healthcare structure. As they say in here, Cuba did it. They did it under sanction.
Yeah. A lot of people were very skeptical of the vaccine because of its rapid development, suggesting that it wasn't properly vetted, it wasn't tested appropriately or whatever. But it's a testament to how well people can do their jobs when they're not held down by these like fucking bureaucratic roadblocks.
Yeah. The point, though, that comes with that is that the ownership of those vaccines is the real thing. Those are still under the companies.
Yeah, they're privatized.
You know, and that's crazy. That's crazy, right? I mean, you know, we're even at a point now, like COVID ain't over. They've stopped offering free vaccinations, basically.
It's not free.
Yeah, exactly. So it's just another financial anxiety, right? Like, it's like they want the pandemic to continue almost. Yeah. I'm not saying that. But, I mean, it's just fucking ridiculous. You know, what do they expect to happen, right? If they make the vaccine not free, then less people will get vaccinated. That's a no-brainer.
Yep.
These things should be free. They should be available. They should be easy. They should be something that you don't even have to think twice about, right? Part of that anxiety is lending itself to this kind of vaccine denial that we see right now anyway, right? Why do these companies want to hawk these vaccines so badly? Well, clearly it's for money, because they see the profit motive behind the development and the deployment of these vaccines. Those things are tied together. I'm more than willing to say that.
Yeah.
Yeah. We could solve that problem fairly easily.
Yeah. The solution is so fucking evident. It's just, it will never happen under capitalism.
Yeah, exactly. Man, I'm just thinking about my mom again. I had this conversation when it might have been 2016 or 2020, but right at the pitch of the Medicaid for All fervor. Mm-hmm. And she was like, well, what about all of the people working at insurance companies, you know? And it's like, I don't even know what to say to that. They're parasitical. They're literally middlemen. What about all the people working there? Well, I'm sure many of them would still be needed. If we're talking about pulling together this structure into something centralized across the entirety of the United States, which, by the way, would be roadblocked by our current federal system, just to support one of the points in this book, those people would still be needed, right? Are you worried about the CEOs? They've got plenty of fucking money. If you're worried about the people that work at the base level, those things would also be solved by something like a jobs guarantee, right? If we're really worried about those people, then we should support them. But allowing this rotten parasitical structure to continue to exist, to wreak havoc on our health mentally and physically, is not acceptable. It will only lead to us being worse off.
It's the middle managers, it's the CEOs, the CFO, the COO, all that fucking shit. Those are the people that are going to go by the wayside, and they can get fucked anyway. Who cares?
Yeah. If you're thinking about the people that actually give a shit about this profession, right, it's not the ones that are driven by profit, believe it or not. The working class people that are working in these industries, they would still do so. The people that are making all the money, that need to make the money, that are making the decisions that make them money, those guys can fucking go. I don't really care what happens to them. Yeah. And hopefully, in our, idyllic super revolution that happened before the writing of this book, they're already dealt with, if you know what I mean. So I think the answer in that regard is pretty straightforward. What do you do with all the people? Well, the people that remain, I'm sure they'll still want to work in the industry, you know what I mean? There will be a centralized People's Bureau of Health and Services or whatever to support them.
Exactly.
So, I don't know, what else did you have for medicine? Was there anything else in this chapter?
There was nothing big. I just have a couple of quotes to call out, I guess. Bottom of 116, top of 117. It's talking about the current market system to healthcare. It fails to acknowledge systemic causes of poor health, such as exposure to environmental toxins and lack of nutritious food. I just wrote murder, it remains right next to it.
Bingo. Part of healthcare is the fact that we're also changing our food.
Yeah.
Not to be so conspiratorial, but the current food system that we have comes with addiction in mind. It comes with unhealth, mishealth, dishealth. It comes with hurt in mind.
Yeah.
It doesn't have your best interest at heart. That's what I'm trying to fucking say. If we're really changing our food system to be something that is by the people, for the people, then that hopefully would also change our health standards too.
Yeah. You change the priority in food production and distribution from profit to health.
Yeah. Think of the burden that would take off of our medical system in its own right. I mean, God, heart failure is like the number one cause of death in the U.S., isn't it?
I think so, among men. Yeah, education. I'm sure we have a lot to say about this.
Many thoughts on education.
Would you like to start?
I think that the best thing to start with right here is on 133. In the capitalist economy, the purpose of public education is to produce obedient workers. Job training is an aspect of this purpose. The public school system does more than promote different career pathways. Its infrastructure, disciplinary policies, and methods of academic assessment teach young people how to behave as workers, reinforcing the unequal class system. That's it right on its face. The way that we do education only benefits capitalism.
Yep. If you've gone through any education program, you should know about what they mention here, which is called the hidden curriculum, all of the kind of invisible things that youth are taught through their relationship with the public education system. It's all about obedience. It's all about, you got to fucking follow the, what do they call the whistles? The steam whistle. We've got bells because it was just like the steam whistles were run in the on the factory floor. You eat only when you're told you can eat. You speak only when you're told you can speak. All of those sorts of things. The hidden stuff that you learn about the way you are expected to navigate the working world as an adult.
Yeah.
They, of course, bring up Paulo Freire, which I was a big fan of reading Pedagogy of the Oppressed. We've talked about reading it for the show.
Yeah, I haven't read it, so I'd be interested.
Yeah, I'm interested. I read it 15 years ago, when I was an undergrad.
Yeah, seeing how your thoughts have changed maybe now that you've gone through the machine.
Exactly. Because my vantage will have shifted in two ways. Like, I've become more radicalized, certainly.
Yeah.
And additionally, I spent 10 years in the trenches as an educator, so I read it when I was a pre-educator. So I am kind of curious to go back to it. That will be really interesting.
Yeah, I think it could be. And just to mention about the hidden curriculum, there are many things that we expect from that hidden curriculum, maybe not the same hidden curriculum, but there are things that are hidden in the curriculum that we teach students that are important, like social skills. Those things could still be part of the ball game, so to speak. But the focus of education as it stands is mostly to crush children down into little boxes that then can be sent off to the machine to do work.
Yeah, grinding through the gears.
Yeah. chop off all the rough edges, make sure they're compliant.
Yep.
If school doesn't work, then they go to the military.
I went into education because I had this belief that reading arms you against oppression. An education is the only thing that prepares you for standing up against oppression.
Yeah, I mean, likewise, that's the only reason I was interested in doing Teach for America is because that's the kernel that I was seeking, is that education is liberatory. Yeah, it's fucked up, man.
Yeah.
It's fucked up the way that we do education. And, I think the thing that hurts me the most about it is just how unequal it is. Like, there is truly good education that exists in the system we have right now. It's just for the rich. I mean, God, even in Atlanta, I lived like 4 streets down from Paideia. All the people I knew that went there were hugely snooty, and they all called their teachers by their first name. We dissected fucking owl shit, and they got octopi baby.
I object to both of those.
Understandable. Understandable. Have a nice day. But still,
the
it's
owl
like
shit, not so much, I guess.
There is a quality of a private education that is appealing. It's just that it is not available to everybody.
Well, and the thing is, education can't be exercised from the community that it exists in. There are excellent educators working in the public school system.
Totally.
That they don't have a fucking chance to do what they hope to do in the classroom, because so much of what a child brings to their education has nothing to do with the school, the classroom.
8 years of iPad.
Yeah, there's just everything is stacked against the teacher. And it's those private schools that you're talking about that have the education in those schools, in my experience, isn't really much better.
It's not.
In fact, the one example that I can speak personally to, it's way worse, but the circumstance around it creates better outcomes.
Exactly. You're 100% right. What I'm thinking about is like all of those studies that are like getting a massage 3 times a week is good for your health. It's like, yeah, if you can afford to get 3 massages a week, I'm sure your health is doing great.
Yeah.
All the funding that's around these places simply assures better outcomes, even if the education is subpar, when even compared to the kind of things that happen in our public schools.
Yeah.
So it's just totally real.
Yeah. My wife and I visited the best rated school in the area. Yeah, we visited this school, sat in on classes, talked to the teachers. And it was fucking abysmal. It was terrible. And it was like, these teachers are bad. This is not a well-run classroom.
Yeah.
But they're doing better. They are doing better. And it was just a very eye-opening experience for us.
Yeah. Who would have thought the key to education is just proper funding, adequate support staff. I always think of that fucking Michael Perney quote where he says, there's no secret to building a school. There's no secret to building a hospital.
You said that in the episode.
I'm sure I have, yeah. These things are well known.
Yeah.
Education, we actually have pretty rigorous study on what works in education, even through the lens of our fucking ridiculous capitalist system. We know phonics is great for reading, and yet we still did 12 years of fucking
whole language.
Whole language
learners.
Whole language, yeah. So, rather than looking at phonics, they were looking at context clues, pictures, things like that.
Yeah.
Ridiculous. We know what works. And we could also figure out what works a lot better outside of the context of this fucking hellscape. That's another point I just want to make. It's not that we have the best methods right now, but even in the context of this insanity, we are still able to figure out how to support children to be curious learners, to go out into the world and do those kinds of things. I mean, those people still come out of the school system. It's just that many, 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 many of them do not.
Yeah, they wash out.
Yeah.
They get sent through the school to prison pipeline mostly.
Yeah. Or, even people that, they graduate normally and then they don't give a fuck.
Yeah.
Right? I know people that haven't read a book since 12th grade, and that's crazy.
They probably didn't read those either, to be honest.
That sucks. I hate that.
Children are, again, to rebel against the educational system that they are forced to be in is a natural response because it is an inherently oppressive system. It is, like we already alluded to, squeezing the life out of them, breaking them down. They're right to push back against it and not want to do it. Why are we reading this? Why am I learning this?
Yeah.
Now, part of that is because they're being programmed outside of school to care about shit that doesn't matter. But that is also a byproduct of this idea of removing the curiosity from them, squeezing the life out of them so they become a drone that just goes and does what we need them to do.
I'm so worried about the future. I mean, every year for the last 5 years, teachers have said this is the worst year so far, and it seems like it's only getting worse. I mean, I know COVID happened, but,
it was bad before that.
Yeah. I'm sure many people were hopeful that COVID would provide such a significant break that we would have to rethink our educational structures. Obviously, that was a ridiculous thing, because it seems that we've only taken the worst parts of the COVID learning and integrated them into our systems. The kind of reliance on technology, that kind of thing that's just constantly aggravating these same problems. Those things have just been integrated into our systems. And it's only the fact that now people are having to think around AI and ChatGPT that they're moving away from those kinds of technologies back to things like pen and paper. But teachers having to try to make that adjustment and still be held to the same standards and grading guidelines and things like that doesn't necessarily equate to positive outcomes.
Nope.
We're jaded.
Yeah.
I only taught for 2.5 years, y'all, and it was rough.
I want to point out one thing from this chapter before we move on.
Yeah.
On 138, they bring up Lev Vygotsky.
Yeah.
And I was flabbergasted. It was so cool. Oh shit, Vygotsky was a Marxist. Anyone that has gone through an educational preparation program to become a teacher knows about Vygotsky, knows about the zone of proximal development.
Not every educational preparation program, let me tell you now.
Okay, if you... Vygotsky is very well known in the sphere of education. Zone of proximal development is probably the thing that he's best known for. If you've ever heard the term scaffolding your learning, that comes from Vygotsky. It's this idea of finding the exact right level of discomfort for a learner to practice to become good at what they're practicing. That's all Vygotsky. It's very sound theory. And one way to prove that it's so sound is that despite the fact that he was an out-and-out Marxist from the USSR, he's still being taught today. His theory is still coming out today. I didn't know he was a Marxist. That was super dope.
Yeah. Aside from that point, just down on the next paragraph, I think that a big thing is that we're changing the education system totally. And I love the line where they say that meaningful projects rooted in real-world issues will constitute the majority of assessments. Teachers will serve as partners and mentors in such projects. You know, it reminds me when we were talking about child labor, and I was saying that there's a way to include education in this, or I should say rather to make labor and education something aligned. And it's things like this, you know, where we're taking children out into the real world and we're using their curiosity. That makes it sound kind of nefarious, but we're taking their curiosity and we're saying, here's the things that you can learn from this experience. And we're taking those experiences and putting them into the real world. I mean, not only does that bolster, I think, the educational outcome here, but it also helps the community too. That's, I think, is really valid. It's kind of almost a further step out from even like a Montessori model, you know, where we're taking the child out and we're saying, observe these things, and then let's apply these principles to the real world.
Yeah, I wrote Montessori model right next to that. It's a form of PBL.
There you go.
Project-based learning.
Yeah. You know, and the thing is that we already trying to institute that into our educational system. It's just that in the current context, it hardly works, you know, because it seems almost farcical. That's where you see all the people complaining about, I mean, I taught math, so this is quite poignant in my mind, you know, where it's like, Johnny had 3 squids that he slid across the ice. 2 squids fell off, you know, like ridiculous word problems like that. They seem so absurd to kids because they aren't rooted in the real world. Yeah. If they actually had to go out and slide 2 squids across the ice or whatever, then it would change their understanding, perhaps. You know, their willingness maybe to learn from that word problem.
Makes me think of that meme of it's like a picture of a guy at Walmart with 2 carts full of mangoes or something. It's like, that motherfucker you talking about in math?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, one last note about education. On 138, we get this line. In a capitalist economy, people who forego post-secondary education in favor of entering the workforce immediately contend with lower pay, demeaning work conditions, and often disparaging judgment from the community. I would push back against that. I think tradespeople respect tradespeople. I think what they're talking about is people that get a formal education looking down on tradespeople, which is definitely true. That stigma exists.
Yeah.
But tradespeople respect tradespeople 100%.
Well, sure. It's just that we don't want to create a divide based on education societally. Yeah. And I think that that's totally valid. Not everyone needs to go to college. I mean, that's just a fact. Would it be great for everyone to go to college? Yes. Do I hope we live in a world where everyone can go to college for some reason? College being something that extends their curiosity and learning and ability? Yeah, that would be fucking fantastic, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be framed within the way that we currently view college.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be solely about making a living or making money. I wish everyone would go to college and know at least a trade.
I mean, honestly, I'd like higher education to just kind of be obliterated as it is. I always think of the Zappa quote where he says that if you want to learn, go to the library. People go to college to get laid, right? Wouldn't it be much better if we just had polyclinics of learning? There is a possibility of totally reframing the way we think about education. You know, rather than thinking about a degree as an award, it's a checkbox.
It's a ticket more than anything.
Yeah, exactly. There is a possibility for creating a society where people can express their own educational possibility in their own ways, in their own communities. They don't have to go off to a college and be, they don't have to be amongst the intelligentsia in order to make a difference in their communities and in themselves.
Yeah.
I'd much rather prefer something where education was woven throughout our lives. Learning doesn't stop when you leave the classroom. I'm sorry for the cliche, but it is literally true. That's it.
Or at least it shouldn't.
Yeah, it definitely does.
Back to those people that haven't read a book in 20 years.
Yeah, I will say before we leave the education chapter that we didn't really mention it. We were mostly harping on about how we currently have a fucking ridiculous educational system, which is totally reasonable. But they do put forth a lot of things, a lot of changes in education.
Oh, yeah, co-teaching is a big one.
Yeah, I mean, free and accessible college, that kind of thing. Classrooms in schools in socialist U.S. will be the gem of every community. The recipients of the best resources that modern technology can offer, microphones and speakers to ensure that students can clearly hear their teachers and peers' remarks, high-quality cameras for distance learning opportunities. Libraries expanded their collections to provide greater electronic book and audiobook access, perhaps one-to-one equivalents for every print book. That'd be great. One thing that I think is absolutely fucking ridiculous is the fact that there's still digital licensing on digital libraries.
Yes.
I use Libby all the time. What do you mean this audiobook is checked out? Send me the file, bro. What's the fucking problem? Gosh, I downloaded it to my phone. You don't even have to stream it. There's no purpose. There's no purpose other than profit. Licensing, middlemanry.
Yeah. Finding a way to extract profit out of.
Yeah. Parasitical rentiersmanship. Rentiering. Fuck it all. Okay, policing. Crime policing and public safety. What do you have on this one, man?
I don't know that there's a lot to be said about this that isn't going to be self-evident to most folks, but I would jump first to a quote on 150, something that I think they establish well. The existing police and courts only retain a veneer of legitimacy because they are also the only institutions tasked with responding to the problems that people naturally do care about in their communities, such as violent crimes and a resolution of other disputes. I think that that's a very good phrase. Veneer is used very intentionally there, because it is a thin covering that is very fragile, but it retains that veneer of legitimacy because it is the only option available to people.
Right. When you need someone to show up 7 hours later and shrug their shoulders, who else are you going to call?
Yeah. They're going to write down all of your comments, maybe shoot your dog, and then leave, and you're not going to recover any of your shit.
Right. Maybe the local crackhead would be more helpful.
Probably.
We're too online, obviously. That we didn't even establish this joke before we started running with it. The police are totally ineffective in many cases. What am I trying to say here? Fuck the police. There's two avenues. One, crime is lowered anyway. Crime, for 99% of the cases, 90% of the time, is caused by a material insufficiency. So if we're taking care of people's material needs, then crime would drop necessarily. You wouldn't need to think about, what am I going to do if someone steals my shit? Because who's going to steal your shit? For what reason? I mean, maybe a crime of passion, that's something that can be resolved without police.
Yeah, what you're talking about are crimes of survival, which they say outright, relieving every person of the struggle for survival by guaranteeing access to quality food, clothing, shelter, health care, and other social needs by itself will drastically reduce a whole assortment of crimes of survival. Yeah. Which is true. Yeah. There will still be crimes of passion, like you said, which does not require the police.
Right. It's something I love that Zoran's doing. I really appreciate his messaging around the police because that's been a big, he's running for the New York mayor. Obviously, the NYPD is a fucking small army of its own. It's a total mob with its own fucking Omerta code and all of that. I really appreciate his messaging because even though, obviously we're in favor of defund the police. The guy's running for office and he's saying, what I want is to make your job for the police easier. I want you to do less work. Wouldn't you like that, policeman? Now, no comment on the fact that they love soaking up overtime, so they probably would not necessarily agree with that. The idea that it's like, it shouldn't necessarily be your job to have to deal with some of these things. Aren't you, officer, sick of dealing with these mental health crises, with drug crises? You only have one way to respond. It's the gun on your hip, right? Or the cuffs on your hip. Those are the tools that you have. We should send someone that is differently equipped for this problem. That's a kind of change that we could see today. It's just that the police are such a bloated institution that we lean on heavily as a society, mostly from the top down, to enforce our laws of private property. Like, we should be able to change some of those things now. It's just that the institution as it currently stands is driven for the protection of private property, not of people. So it's not profitable to do those kinds of things. I mean, God, even when we think about, I remember my dad telling me to be careful driving at the end of the month because they had to meet their ticketing quota. The fact that the money from fines from the police goes back into our budget, that's totally fucked up. I mean, it makes sense on a level. You're going to fine somebody, what do you do with the money? But
creates a conflict of interest.
yeah, and it also quickly becomes inverted where you need that money, so you do the fines. It's not that you did the fines and now you have the money and you have to do something with it. It's that the budget's looking a little empty. You better get out there on the streets and ticket that guy for driving while black or something. It's crazy.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm just starting to feel, as you said in the beginning, a lot of this stuff is so self-evident. But I think that that's honestly one of the strengths of this book is that it's built off of what we have today. If tomorrow we were to have power, don't worry about how we got it. How could we change the institutions we have today to make things truly better for us? Right? It's evident.
Yeah, I think the strength to what we are perceiving as the intended audience of this book is the common sense, common language approach that they take to solving these problems or responding to these problems.
Right.
So for all of the online leftists that are like, communists need to stop talking above the audience, like if you can't explain it in common language, don't explain it at all. This book does that for you. It is quite self-evident. It explains it in a very plain-spoken way.
Yeah.
So I don't have a lot to say about this or the last chapter in that regard. I would point out a couple of quotes from this chapter just to throw it out there. On 159, they're talking about sexual violence, and my response is maybe a little spicy, but they say in the middle of the page, the new society, unlike the current racist, sexist, capitalist system, will not just pay lip service to the issue of sexual violence. It will invest resources in education, media, public health campaigns, and other efforts that address patriarchal violence and work to end it. The socialist government will investigate and adjudicate cases of sexual assault through processes of justice attentive to the needs of those most impacted. There is not likely to be a one-size-fits-all consequence for patriarchal violence. But there kind of is, though. There kind of is, though.
Let me tip this down a little bit here, because I think that I'm thinking about Marx, honestly, when he's talking about the ideal of justice, right? Our pursuit of justice is important, but pursuing it will change it. The ideal of justice will be changed when we have a society that has a different relationship with its own production. And I think that there's something to be said about that here. While I do understand what you're saying when you're saying that there is, in fact, a one-size-fits-all, I think that there are repercussions of extreme, like of an extreme reaction. I mean, it's such a common conservative point where they're like, we should just castrate all the pedophiles. But there's a real issue with that, because having that kind of ultimate nuclear option be the thing will lead to people not reporting pedophiles. There is a problem there. So I think this is a case where it is important to stress the fact that there has to be something other than a one-size-fits-all solution, even though I understand.
Yes, I acknowledge that. I'm saying that with, I wouldn't say firmly in cheek, but with my tongue in cheek.
Yeah.
Because I do believe in the idea of a restorative justice model.
Yeah.
I do like the idea of a community and those survivors of these acts having an ultimate say in how these things get. Reparations are paid to them and the community or anyone else that has been hurt.
Yeah, I know you're just being cheeky there.
I don't have a problem with that solution being a one-size-fits-all solution.
Okay, and I will say that even in the next paragraph, right, and I know they're talking about domestic cases here, not necessarily sexual violence, but they're saying that it's not that there isn't a serious repercussion involved. Exclusion from certain community activities could be in order, or total residential segregation, incarceration, right? And that's pretty strong coming from a society where we've talked about essentially abolishing incarceration as it currently stands. The fact that there are still severe repercussions for these kinds of things, there are still, I almost said natural consequences, but actual consequences for these things, that is important. It's just that it has to be something that's community driven. It has to be something that is in the true pursuit of justice, whatever that means in our society.
Yeah. And they say that this will be built and empowered by mass women's organizations that are instrumental in leading the way and deciding the outcomes. So
yeah,
I defer.
I gotcha. I know. I know. One thing I will say here, just on the very next paragraph, 159.
Okay.
By blending popular mobilization with a new legal system, socialism prepares the way for its own state institutions to become obsolete and wither away. So, very happy to see that in there.
Shout out Lenin.
Yeah, shout out Lenin. I mean, they're Octoberists after all. I just think that's so important. Something that you must remember if we're talking about building socialism is the inclusion of the people. That sounds silly to say it almost like that, but we're really talking about mobilizing every single person we can into the political structure.
Yeah, activating.
Yeah, there has to be that process, right? A balance between the democratic centralism that we are trying to put forth, this unity here, and a massive, massive movement. That's the only way this is going to work. If you don't allow the party to become this massive thing that is controlled by everybody in the truly democratic sense that we're talking about, then it's not going to wither away in the way that we're expecting it to. I think that is really a truly important thing. That's been the way that I've been able to resolve the issue of the state in my mind, is that expansion of the state until it's withering away. And I think that that's just truly important here. You know, we've seen that in every serious Leninist that we've read so far. Lenin, Stalin, even Mao. I know he's not necessarily a Leninist in the same regard, but we're talking about including every person that we can into the political process, right? Politics needs to be personal.
Yep. Before they get to the war chapter, on 162, they kind of start talking about counter-revolution.
Counter-revolution, yeah. I know this was something we had mentioned earlier.
Yeah, because, I mean, just broadly, it feels like a hand-wave non-answer. And I think an area where it seems like you and I are not in complete alignment in our belief in the appropriate response is around, like, how to deal with counter-revolution. What is the appropriate... I'm a little faster to the trigger than you are, I think.
Well, it seems that they're advocating for... Well, I mean, first off, I just want to say on 162, right? They say that the most effective defense is the mobilized masses of people.
Yes.
And I think that that's totally reasonable.
Agreed.
But afterwards, when there's a return to, quote, normal life, what will maintain vigilance against the emergences of violent contradictions? And what they advocate for is essentially the People's Neighborhood Watch.
Yeah.
Like...
They were talking about the CDR in Cuba. It feels like a half-baked idea.
Well, I think that part of the reason is that counter-revolution can take so many forms. You know, when we're talking about what will be done in retaliation to this reconstruction process, there's so many different things that could happen. There's to talk about, like, what the exact structure is in this regard, especially, is putting the cart before the horse. Because what counter-revolution would look like is different in many places. You know, I'm thinking about, like, fucking Idaho, which is probably 30% fascist militia at this point.
Shout out Idaho.
The Oklahoma Panhandle is full only of violent extremists. I'm certain of that. There will be situations where violence is met with violence, I'm sure. But when we're talking about, like, counter-revolution could be a lot of things, even just like someone advocating back to capitalism, somebody trying to shirk the system for their own personal gain. But under Lenin's NEP, right, they were trying to spur a lot of cooperative development, and what happened a lot of times is that people would make up fake cooperatives. They would make up fake cooperatives and say, I'm employing all these people, we're part of a cooperative, and they would just kind of rebuild a capitalist structure. Inside of that, they would then sell to the Soviet market. So, like, that's counter-revolutionary in its own right. A community defense group could do something about that, and it wouldn't necessarily be, you know, like a militia, right? I'm not talking about people with fucking guns and leather caps walking in and, shut it down, pig! You know, not necessarily.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think it is a little hand-wavy here, but I think that this is one of those things where I'm willing to say we'll have to see.
Yeah, I'm really struck by Stalin's line about being caught between two fires. And on 162, at least, they do say in this book, a socialist government must possess new state institutions to stop, by any means necessary, those who would otherwise wreck and overthrow it from outside and from within. It would be a betrayal of the whole revolutionary process to end exploitation and oppression if the new socialist government allowed the old ruling class to regroup, reorganize, return to power, subjecting hundreds of millions of people to the old system. They would have to be stopped. So maybe that's their answer to your question, what happened to all the capitalists?
Yeah, they better be in check.
Yeah.
Or else.
Exactly.
The old man's back again. So that's all I can say.
But that's all I got for this chapter.
Yeah. I will say that they do mention a little bit more about the withering away of state institutions. And I know that they're outright socialists, but I just appreciate this quote on 163. It is possible for humanity to arrive at such a society in the future, communism, on a new basis of advanced technology, planning, and material abundance. It is only through the mass of people gaining the experience of governing with all of its problems and contradictions that the reliance on institutions standing above society will diminish by equal measure.
Yeah.
That reliance, I think, is so key. Why are we relying on institutions? It's because we have to be. If we created a society where institutions weren't necessary, there would be no institutions. You know, or there would be fewer institutions, right?
Yeah.
Institutions would no longer take such a leading role in our life.
Exactly.
Right? If your issue with the state is that, those centralized hierarchical institutions, then that should be the thing you're aiming for. It's not going to happen right away, right? But we could get to that point.
Yeah. I mean, even just the example that we were talking about with community gardens.
Yeah.
If you don't know how to garden, you don't know any of that sort of shit, you're reliant upon whatever system of agriculture is in place that makes food readily available to you. Once you learn how to take those things over for yourself or are a part of a community where those things are, self-sustaining, then you no longer are reliant on any greater sort of apparatus. And therefore, it is only through the education and practice of learning to use and do for yourself that the need goes away, and so it is no longer necessary to have that larger apparatus.
There you go. Yeah. So they're Leninists at the end of the day.
Good.
Yeah. All right. And then lastly, ending imperialist wars, building a world of solidarity and peace. I don't know how much we've kind of talked about this chapter through and through.
Yeah, a little bit. Just a couple of things I would call out just to bring attention to them, I guess. There's a banger Martin Luther King Jr. quote on 169. Before he was killed by the FBI, when he was speaking out against the Vietnam War, we get this great quote: "The bombs in Vietnam explode at home. They destroy the hopes and possibilities for a decent America." Banger quote. Why isn't that the one that kids are learning all of the time in second grade for Black History Month?
Yeah, man.
I wonder why.
Gosh. The military is like one of the biggest polluters in the globe. We literally expend our resources we blow them up. We take all of our money and we blow it up. We shoot it into the ground. We blow it up. The Navy literally dumps ammunition just to keep their guns in good check. They'll just fucking fire it off at the land over there. What's the point? The only reason we do that is because of this insane, jingoistic, capitalistic, imperialist society that we live in. That could be changed. That could be done away with. The Pentagon has a black budget of fucking $500 million. That's unitemized. They can do whatever the fuck they want with it.
Yep.
They do not have oversight on that stuff. That is crazy. Crazy. What are we defending against? There is nothing. There is no threat. The biggest threat in the globe is the United States of America. And that's a goddamn fact, man. I mean, we have military bases in 81 countries. Out of all foreign bases in the world, I'm looking at 169, more than 95% belong to the United States.
Yep.
What are those military bases doing? Do you think our military bases in Germany are keeping the peace? What are they doing? They're just a place for us to launch more foreign aggression. It's fucking ridiculous.
Yep. And a nice reminder that they put at very early in the chapter on the top of 166. Working people in the United States have 1,000 times more in common with workers in China, Russia, Cuba, and South Africa than we do with the billionaire bankers and bosses here.
Absolutely.
It really is that fucking simple.
Yeah. I mean, God, the U.S. in 2021, right, their military budget was larger than the next 9 countries combined.
Yep.
Okay? Why are we so afraid of China again? You think that we would outspend... I mean, we literally do outspend them. $2.50 to 1. Mm-hmm. It's fucking insane. But I still think it's, probably 50-50. We're a hugely bloated military. I mean, when you learn about some of the things that the military's done, the Air Force Museum's right over there, dude. You can go see all the experimental aircraft they were fucking around with, fucking people's minds up, making them think they were seeing aliens. They have a helicopter with jet engines on the edge of the propellers. I had a guy stop me and tell me that it would blast rocket fuel all over the place when they used it. That's why it didn't get any further than that. I was like, that's crazy. We spent money on this?
Yeah.
Some guy was just like, yeah, let's try this. Put a fucking jet engine on the end of that thing. Ridiculous what we spend our money on.
Yeah.
You could build 1,000 schools with that. You could build 20,000 hospitals with that kind of money.
I mean, yeah, to that point on 169, farther down the page, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan will end up costing a minimum of $7 trillion, a large part of which has never been accounted for, amounting to corruption on the largest scale in history.
Yeah, think about our debt crisis in the heaviest scare quotes possible.
Yeah.
What was it, $17 trillion? We've flushed half of that down the toilet, and what have we gotten out of it? The Taliban control Afghanistan. Iraq is in complete shambles, and it has been. We killed millions of people. We sent thousands of soldiers to die.
Yep.
We disillusioned our entire population with the idea of foreign war. We've tarnished America's reputation beyond belief, and it cost us $7 trillion. That's crazy. George W. Bush should be... Anyway. There is
a solution.
There is a one size... There is a one size... Yeah. You're exactly right. The guy should have thrown something heavier than a shoe, I'll tell you that much.
One point that has always kind of stuck in my craw when we've talked about arming the working class, and they bring it up here on 174. Defense of the revolutionary government will be constructed on the basis of the armed, organized working class. And it's like, yes, the working class should be armed, should know how to use their weapons, under no pretext, that whole thing, I got it.
Yeah.
But also, are you fucking kidding me? Like, is my neighborhood militia going to stand up to the current military apparatus as we see it? And do we foresee in a 10-year period that escalating to a point where it could stand against, a global power in defense of our new socialist reconstructed United States. That just feels a little naive. Maybe I'm being too cynical there, but
I think this is another situation where it's too contextual. What happened in the revolution really matters, right? Because I don't know, in a parallel to like the USSR, right? The US becomes socialist and they have to do socialism in one country, and the rest of the world is suddenly taken an incredibly antagonistic position. They've all banded together to do the United Capitalist Nations of the world versus the US.
Yeah.
China's keeping its neutrality because they always do that kind of shit. Then I could see a national militia being something that is required. Like how in Vietnam they train, everybody knows how to use a gun, right? Everybody gets trained in not guerrilla warfare necessarily, but like in a defensive tactic. And I think that in the context of Vietnam as it stands today, that makes sense. I don't necessarily think they're under threat from their neighbors. There's obviously some stuff going on in Southeast Asia right now with Thailand and Cambodia, Myanmar, all of that. But in that context, I could see a national militia. If we were to do the super U.S. revolution and do socialist reconstruction, the U.S. is the head of the snake cut off, global capitalism starts to die, then I don't necessarily see the same need. You know what I mean? That's where I kind of see the point there, where it's like, do we really need everyone to be armed? I have different feelings about everyone knowing how to use a weapon anyway. In a kind of withering away sense, I think it's not necessary in the longest term. It's just a question of how necessary it is in the short term. And maybe that's just a part of the People's Neighborhood Watch, like we were talking about earlier.
Maybe.
Yeah. I had to laugh on 174, though, because at the top they just say, the first objective is shutting down the Pentagon. Then they close all foreign military bases. Then the CIA and other instruments of subversion and counter-revolution will be dismantled. So easy.
Yeah.
Wow.
You just go in, all right, boys, you're out.
Hey, everybody. Pack it up. Go home. You're fired. That seems a little crazy, too. Talk about a source of counter-revolution. That would be it. I mean, we literally did stay-behind armies in Western Europe. Operation Gladio, that's what it was all about. There were sleeper cells that were in the country. If it were to be taken over, right, if revolution were to happen, those people would be activated. That's a real thing that really happened. There's no tinfoil hat here. Operation Gladio is really real. You can look it up. Do I think similar systems exist in the U.S.? I can't rule it out. That's for sure.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's a whole network of fucking super bunkers for the ultra-wealthy. That's all I can really say. Maybe we do need a people's militia after all, actually. I'm changing my tune already.
There you go. You found the way. On 175, I just liked this. The U.S. existing colonial relationships will be dissolved. The independence of Puerto Rico will be immediately recognized. Samoa, Guam, the Virgin Islands, the Mariana Islands will be free to exercise their right to self-determination up to and including independence. Native treaties and sovereignty will be honored and restitution provided. So like we had touched on in the last episode when we were closing and talking about land back, like my understanding of the basic premise of what that looks like in the United States is honor the treaties that were signed 150 years ago.
Right.
And that's what they're saying. Okay, day one, we do that.
Bingo. I think that's totally reasonable.
Yep, agreed.
It's like really the only way we can move forward at this point.
And just the seismic kind of shift that would happen to just make an acknowledgement like that and do it. You don't got to do all this there don't have to be a million committees. It's like, this is it. Here it is. There you go. Sorry about all that.
And, you don't have to do the land acknowledgement if you've given the land back. I'll just say that. If you're sick of land acknowledgements, here's a great solution.
There you go.
If they own the land, you don't have to say this is former X and X land. It's current X and XY land,
Yeah. And then I suppose the last comment I have here, this was written in 2022, keep in mind, so I appreciate that they say on 176 and 177, Israel, which rules over the Palestinian people through a vicious apartheid system, not only is never sanctioned, but receives more than $4 billion a year from U.S. taxpayers in unconditional grants. That dollar amount is obviously different now. And then continuing on, moreover, all aid and international support to regional oppressors around the world will be ended, especially for the apartheid state of Israel. The right of the Palestinian people to return to their homeland will be supported, and they will be compensated for their losses. From the river to the sea, I would just say for everybody that thinks that this struggle started on October the 7th, it very clearly did not, to anyone that had their eyes open.
Yeah. All I can really say is that I think it's impossible to read about the history of Israel without realizing how fucking crazy it is.
Flying into a blind rage?
Yeah, it's insane. 3 paramilitary organizations did enough terrorism that the British said, sure, you can have it. That's pretty much it.
Yep.
And they've been doing apartheid ever since. One thing I will say is that, like, the U.S. does have socialized healthcare. The U.S. does have socialized education in Israel. Yeah, in Israel. Our taxes pay for that.
Yep.
You know, that's crazy.
That's kind of a downer note to end on. Sorry, do you have something else?
No. They talk about the UN at the very end. I mean, I don't mind ending it on that note. Not the last line, but peace is not just an absence of fighting at a particular moment. Peace requires justice, particularly for those who, for so long, have been denied it. To end it off, peace requires the socialist reconstruction of the United States. And I just think that's it. Right?
Hey, that's the name of the book.
Yeah. There is no future without socialism.
100%.
Of that, I am more than certain. And that was it.
That's it.
Socialist Reconstruction by the Party for Socialism and Liberation. What questions did this book leave you with, Aaron?
I don't think I have any left that we didn't discuss already.
Yeah. My biggest question is about the market. Maybe they left it unsaid for a good reason, that it's a complex issue to solve.
Yeah.
But it's something I'd like a little more elaboration on there. What happened in the revolution is the ultimate question of this book. But yeah, those are my two.
Okay. I would read this book if I intended to give it to other people.
I think that's a great answer. I think that's a supremely good one.
I think that this is a great book to hand off to another person that you want to start a conversation with, or you see is on the path to awakening their consciousness. That sounded very new agey, but
I don't mean this to be pejorative, but I think that this is a great book if you're a baby leftist. I hate that term.
Yeah.
I hate that term. If you have literally no idea of what a socialist society could look like, I think this is not a bad way of looking at what could be changed in the U.S. I think you should read this if you're going to give it to someone. I think this is a great answer. This gives me more confidence about PSL as a whole. Even though the main issue is how are we getting to the revolution. That's what I'm not confident in PSL for.
I do think you brought up a valid point in terms of organization, in that PSL is established, is sizable, and has, at least at this point, enough kind of cachet to even put a candidate on the ballot for a major U.S. election. And that's not something to swing our nose up at. You know what I mean? Like, you could do worse.
Yeah. There are certainly critiques of PSL that exist out there, but they're the same critiques of every organization that exists today. Cultishness, cover-ups, lots of things, right? They are not without flaw. That much is obvious, but,
yeah, but
what can you do? Go make your own, I guess. You know, good fucking luck.
But that's the problem.
I said it on this episode. I said it on this episode.
Yeah.
The problem I have with PSL is that if I went and made my own shit, it would become the same thing. I don't understand fundamentally what would be different about my party, TM.
But it's even, I don't know. I mean, we've beat this point to death at this point, I guess. But, like, we can't just continue to break off into smaller and smaller sects because we have one disagreement or we don't agree with one particular thing. We're not in alignment with every aspect of what we think an organizing party should look like, because then we're never going to mobilize together.
Yeah.
I don't know. So I'm becoming more open to the idea of letting go of purity politics.
Yeah, as am I. It's just that there is a certain amount that is required, you know?
I agree. There is a line.
Yeah, there is a line. Maybe PSL doesn't cross it, though.
I don't know.
All right. What are we reading next?
Next, we're going to read Labour in Irish History by James Connolly.
Yeah. Excited to read something about Ireland. I know mostly the context we talked about Ireland is about the Troubles, but I think that Connolly's one of the goats, or so I've heard. So it'll be interesting to read, and hopefully you'll join us. If you have other recommendations about Ireland, Socialist Reconstruction, or otherwise, as well as any thoughts, critiques, suggestions, limericks, you can email it to us, leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you.
That's right. Grab your Connolly reader and be ready for the next episode.
And don't get left unread.
Bye-bye.
See ya.